How many parts of speech does English have? Ha, passing along a classroom question from your grammar teacher there. Maybe you remember your school days and can name them all. Well, now let's talk about other languages. Have you ever wondered if they have the same list? Today we get animated about parts of speech your textbook was hiding from you. Dramatic. Well, at least let's expand that old list. And then, sneaky surprise, we'll meet languages that shake up the parts of speech grammarians have taken for granted for centuries. Set the scene. English class. It's grammar time. Teacher points to several terms in your textbook. They start short, but down the list they grow into this long Latinate jargon. These are the parts of speech. Every word falls into one of these. You study the labels, memorize them, then analyze each word in a sentence as you run it through the parts of speech strainer. Then again, some of you were real language nerds. I bet reading dictionaries was your hobby and you were busy absorbing jargon osmotically. Either way, we learned an old story, older than I knew, as dusty manuscripts made clear to me while researching for this. Anyhow, at first I found them tiresome, but once said speech parts wormed their way into my brain, I couldn't stop. I'd pull grammars off shelves and feel tickled any time I bumped into a word class I never imagined a language could have. Years since have pulled my focus elsewhere, like animation, and other things have been tugging at my heart, like these causes of the people, more about them when we wrap up. But now I find myself looking back at the part of speech collection I've been sitting on. Before dizzying and dazzling us with them, a quick note. While making this, I did peek at stricter criteria from people closer to these examples, from the theories to the cultures they're knotted up with. I got bogged down and made a whole sources document out of it. But here, today, can we just list the fun stuff? Let's warm up with loose ends from 2 prior videos. You've heard of verbs. Well, Mongolic languages have those. Maybe you're comfy with participles. Lucky you. What about converbs? They turn verbs into something adverbial. Before doing, after doing, if doing. To Mongolia's south and east, a swath from Ainu to Malay is home to classifiers. You might count paper by sheets or tea by the cup. Well, Thai also has counters for people, most animals, circular slices, heaps of stuff, and ... Speaking of, numerals themselves were traditionally considered a part of speech in Lithuanian, a practice one cynic scrutinizes as useless. Instead, head back to classifier-rich languages to meet one that officially does not count classifiers among its official parts of speech, but does number numerals among its 9 pumsa parts of speech. The next language, Karinya, agrees on numerals, but not on prepositions. Like so many languages, they put postpositions after words. Another friendly channel reminder that adpositions are a thing. Remember Siberia's languages? We met many of them, including one that smushes the number and classifier together. Indeed, Nivk numerals are themselves count words that sort every noun into one of 27 boxes. Let's wrap up our warm-ups with a good stretch. One dictionary I use for this channel splits all words in Te Reo Maori into meaning-rich bases versus particles that surround those bases. What's the sound of someone smiling? Japanese goes big on ideophones, words that imitate a sound, a feeling, a sense, or an image. And in Nigeria, kuteb expressives include the same senses, plus a set of odor or smell words. Not too far away, Eboze has insultatives used in jokes, epithets, and, as the name implies, insults. Oh, way to the south, but still in the same language family, Xhosa ideophones are audibly distinctive. A number are borrowed from Nama speakers, and these are much more likely to contain click consonants than the average Xhosa word. Okay, this audience has watched me struggle to write classic Maya. This frequent word in inscriptions is a positional, relating someone's position, form, or shape. Jumlach, enthroned, instead of sat would have been jumach. And this one is an affective. From the loud bach of a hammer, we get bachlach, hammering. Understandably, my textbook taught these under verbs, but to other linguists they're distinct. Across the lowlands, Mayatan today tightly interweaves voice and gesture. The word beyo draws the eyes. When you hear beitak or bukach, watch for a hand to disambiguate height or size. Meaning remains incomplete without this visual vocal interplay. On hands or tongues, language is language. But let's talk sign languages. Papers I've read did seem to highlight a few signing specific parts of speech. First on the list is a list of first, second, anything or anyone you're keeping track of in conversation, really. Pointing to fingers on the non-dominant hand is a strategy with a number of uses, and a name that I love, buoys, like in the ocean. Beyond hands, there are facial adverbials, mouth morphemes like rounded lips, puffed cheeks, raised or lowered eyebrows, and beyond faces consider the head shake in katakolop or body shift in ASL. A conceptually tricky one for a mention and run, but let's try. The use of sign space and eye gaze at its most basic involves pointing and looking, a strategy that yields indexicals, including demonstratives and what experts debate are or are not personal pronouns. In some languages, though not you Libras, but yes you Auslan, sign space gets used for depictive/classifier predicates. And I'll stop there, lest we pour the rest of our time today into what one line of research calls polycomponential verbs. Mouthful much? Lots left, let's pick up the pace. Philippine languages, which are different from Philippine-type languages, we should talk, but Austronesian languages of the Philippines have a short linker, whose big job is to show up when another word is being modified. Blagar elevationals include unelevated here and there, as well as elevationals to mark locations that are higher than, lower than, or level with you. In parallel, there are verbs and demonstratives that also distinguish unelevated, high, mid, and low places. Creoles. Now there's a term, one some writers are swaying me to think is more social than linguistic, but linguists tend to analyze them as analytic, turning up bunches of these small markers. In Bislama, there's a plural marker before nouns, and a little e that marks predicate agreement. Juba Arabic simply uses a ta for possession, and in Belize, cho is a discourse marker for engaging in rough talk. In Micronesia, and this is a familiar tune throughout the Pacific, Satawalis has directional particles. Away, towards, upwind, downwind, inland, seaward. A voyage won't only involve going, but going in one of these directions. There's also a history of using linguistic prowess to form an island chain relief system, but some other time. Yucatec Maya Sign Language has a body shift that's rare in the West, turning fully away, mid-conversation, to abide by a geocentric frame of reference when showing how something was done or placed. Since we're hopping around so much, how about check? When verbs overlap, one happens while the other does, you may need the transitional or transgressive. It sits vaguely between participle, adverbial, and converb. Sandawe has mediative markers. You may know clitics, pronounced together with a host word but do their own grammatical work, while these clitics hook onto stuff to mark certainty, inferences, or yes-no questions. Amir Grammar has long analyzed everyday language and literary works alike as dynamic products of systematic transformations. Still, the number 4 does come up for nouns, verbs, structural, and indeclinable words. English. Wait, wasn't this all supposed to be about not English? Well, when computationally tagging text, it has proved handy to separate out potentially surprising parts of speech, like existential there and possessive apostrophe s. Well, so now it looks like it's English versus English. Wait though, computers reading Tigrinya are also instructed to spot 9 expected word classes, but the tag set includes oddities as well, like punctuation and unclassified, so we should take a moment to acknowledge the idiosyncrasies of tagging digital text. Moments passed. Garifuna time. They wobble a list a bit when they sideline pronouns, inflect prepositions for person, number, gender, and case, and employ negators that follow their own logic. Garifuna wobbliness will portend the grammatical trials ahead. Swedish Sign Language assigns a name sign to community members. Broadly speaking, we could call them proper nouns, but with their own conventions for creation and usage, such as no vocatives, sign names have become their own subject of studies. Possessive classifiers are unlike the classifiers we met before, those focused on a noun's form when counted. These are about a noun's function when possessed. If a language has 2, one is usually more immediate or, quote, inalienable than the other. Her book by her that she wrote, or her book of her that she finished reading. Then again, anum in Papua New Guinea has far more than 2. South from there, Northern Australian languages split the job of a verb in 2. IVs are a closed set tasked with inflecting for pesky grammatical stuff like tense, and UVs are numerous, open, and carry verbal meanings, but are never inflected. Distant but close in spirit, Chichimasha has a set of preverbs for marking direction or aspect before the verb. Other tense aspect mood markers also struck me as not dissimilar. Soninke predicate markers also convey polarity, while Akuwenshirenti adds person to the mix. Many sign languages have a set of size and shape specifiers that represent the dimensions and outlines of objects being talked about. Remember Mishtek? One relative, Itunyoso Triki, is also highly tonal, and ends sentences with 39 final particles. Bonus puzzle. If these question particles match the verb's aspect, an aspect must flip in negative sentences. How would I end a sentence asking what you might not do tomorrow? Whew, tired yet? So I've added and added and added to our list, but after building up, time to break down. To avoid a steep drop into doubt, take 4 shallow steps with me. Hishkariana has a general modifier instead of adjectives and adverbs. Some find one in Dutch too. West Greenlandic uses verbs for your adjectives, which is actually a common approach in North America, and not only. You again, Korean? Tupi and Guarani are all nouns and verbs, despite efforts of colonial grammars to squeeze out other parts of speech. And then there's Turkish, which I'm assured has but verbs and non-verbs. Not nouns, because non-verbs do other work. Okay, now help me cast doubt by wondering about big, flexible, or what even are parts of speech. Last examples, and then we part. As a kid, I fondly recall opening a mini Navajo dictionary to a list of 15 parts of speech. Well, scrutiny boils all those down to 3. Nouns, verbs, the rest are particles. Which reminds me of the classic take on Arabic grammar. It's the same 3 boxes. And the word-likeness of those particles can get messy, like the many clitic forms in Palestinian Arabic. And Oneida likewise has nouns, verbs, and particles, except kin terms have properties of both nouns and verbs, so a word seems to be able to intersect multiple classes depending on meaning. Wakashan languages mark tenses or aspects on nouns as well as verbs. Such barrier breaking suggests their verbs and nouns are, quote, mere discourse tendencies. And verbs in Ket suggest a kind of similar history of messy verbal nounness. Some of the biggest part of speech drama I've read of swirls around classical Chinese. Are word classes flexible, or are there none? And around Nahuatl omnipredicativity. Is everything just a predicate? Then claims of mundari parts of speechlessness led me down a whole paper trail. Is it missing word classes? Do all languages really even have nouns and verbs? Well, as we wrap up, consider how this kind of questioning of neat parts of speech cubbies also challenges something more basic. In the process of evaluating daunting caches of unread tablets, Sumerologists have concluded that the word word doesn't quite fit Sumerian. Instead, they have to resort to studying how links attach within chains. For a cautionary example, take the ventive. A small mu, or just m in a chain, may mean I, or hither, or up, or be too slippery to grasp at all. My, this list grew long. Every item on it seems somehow both more precious and precarious than it did before I began. As minutes passed, it felt less and less like we were directly observing parts of speech, more like we got stuck in the delightful muck of language is people. And hey, look, you're people. So, what's your favorite part of speech? In which language? Did any today surprise or challenge you? Also, heartbeats to everyone who supported groups since the Mishtek video, community posts, and sources document links. It really is time for another call to understand and aid actually those same communities speaking several of the languages mentioned today. And if you create things or have a platform, there are resources where you can study up and forward the message about these struggles that intertwine with language, culture, environment, and land. We need thickets of effective clarity, long-haul stuff. That aid comes first, but if you have more to spare, join my lovely channel patrons. Thank you all for watching. Stick around and subscribe for more about languages and cultures.
For all the time that Japanese movies, TV, and animation have existed, characters have primarily spoken so-called Standard Japanese, based on the Tokyo area's modern dialect. However, across the decades, creators and actors from other parts of Japan have given life to characters speaking dialects distinct from the capitals. If the series in question gets popular enough worldwide to warrant official subtitles or a dub, the task of translating the unique vibes and images of Japanese dialects becomes something localizers have to grapple with, and it's a very complicated problem indeed. Specifically, characters bearing the dialect of Japan's Kansai region have had wildly varying treatments in translation for English audiences. Some localizers equate it to a rural Southern American accent. Others feel the vibes of Manhattan, Brooklyn, or even Boston suit it better.
I don't know how to put this, but you got a pretty different look going. Is that what's it?
There's at least one example of the same character receiving one treatment and switching to the other. That poses the question, why is this problem so difficult, and is there a single best option? The idea that Japan is a country of just one uniform language is a fantasy. A language is a dialect with an army and navy and all that. Major regional differences exist, even encompassing some of the most common words in use, and tens of millions of people use the language in a manner very different from inhabitants of the capital. Kansai, of people use the language in a manner very different from inhabitants of the capital. Kansai, also known as Kinki, is a region in the central western Japan with major historic, economic, and cultural importance. 3 of Japan's 10 largest cities lie within it, most importantly the longtime imperial capital Kyoto, and Osaka, the anchor of the country's second largest urban area. For various cultural and historical factors, the attempts to enforce a standard variety of Japanese across the whole nation haven't completely succeeded in Kansai, leaving a population of about 20 million still speaking a cavalcade of local dialects in day-to-day life. For the sake of this video, I'm going to use the terms Osaka dialect and Kansai Ben interchangeably, but I want to acknowledge beforehand that Kobe, Kyoto, and all the other subregions of Kansai all possess their own history and quirks. Historically, the Kyoto dialect was the closest thing to a national standard until the 17th century. It was the home city of the imperial court, and Kansai more broadly was Japan's undisputed cultural and political center for all of the Asuka, Nara, Heian, and Muromachi periods, up until the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of Edo in the east. Keep in mind that any differences I talk about between dialects aren't divergences from the modern quote-unquote correct way of using the language. Standard Japanese is ultimately just one of many ways Middle Japanese ended up evolving. With all that said, let's get started. First, let's look at the linguistic and functional differences between Standard and Osakan Japanese. While the most noticeable divergences between English varieties primarily stem from different phonetics, like R's being pronounced versus dropped, whether or not certain vowels have been merged, or whatever's going on when Brits say wa'u-bo'u, Kansai Ben and Standard Japanese share almost all of their consonant and vowel sounds. Their most visible distinctions instead come from differences in grammar, vocabulary, intonation, and etiquette. The single most recognizable and noticeable feature of Kansai Ben is the use of ya in lieu of da. Those two, alongside des, are actually contractions of the same phrase, despite how different they sound, dearu in its polite form dearimasu. Speakers in Kansai contracted the fast dearimasu to ya, while Eastern Japan ended up with da, and Hiroshima, Shikoku, and Kyushu got ja. Excluding particles, da is the most common word in the language, so the Osakan alternative of ya is very apparent when hearing them speak. This change is also reflected in related verbs and conjunctions being changed, like dakara to yakara, and soda to hoya. Kansai Ben's unique negations are its second most iconic feature. Rather than nai, verbs are inflected into the negative with the suffix hen. In Standard Japanese, the casual forms of verbs use nai as a suffix to indicate not doing or being something, with more formal speech using masen. A verb like tobu, to fly, would conjugate to tobanai in Standard Japanese, but tobahen in Kansai Ben. Taberu becomes tabehen. Kau, to buy, becomes kawahen, or kayahen in Osaka specifically, and yurusu, to allow, becomes yurusahen. Adjectives will use either nai or arahen, with the latter derived from aru in a chain that goes something like this. Nouns can be made negative with the suffix nanai or hochao. The latter comes from chigau, the verb for being different or incorrect. Chao is used as an alternate, more colloquial dewanai or janai, in addition to being a shortening of chigau. Despite seeming like a contraction on its surface, it's been used so long that it's considered a completely separate word, even conjugating differently from chigao. Going back to hen, it actually stems from masen, believe it or not. A notable phonetic shift that happened in Kansai, but not Kanto, was many sa words morphing to ha, which can also be seen in Seoul, becoming whole, and then just whole. In Standard Japanese, conjugations to adjective ending in e only ever modify that last kana, but in Kansai Ben, the syllable before it can also change.
Yeah, I don't
In
like the long
Tokyo,
vowel
the adverbial
either,
form that most
so it's
other
just
inflections
for-
are based on
it's,
simply replaces e with ku. Osakans instead modify the word to end in an extended o or u. For example, waruku versus waru or takaku and tako. Hayai, fast. Modify the word to end in an extended o or u. For example, waruku versus waru or takaku and tako. Hayai, fast in the negative becomes hayakunai
Hayo.
in standard, but hayonai or hayo arahen in Kansai. Notably, many
Yo,
differences in Kansai
that's
Ben serve to
where
make the dialect
Ohio
feel
comes
faster
from.
compared to the standard language. The suffixes daro and sol are both one more
Yaro.
shorter, dropping the extended
Yaro.
vowel. Common Osakan colloquial terms are often shorter than their standard synonyms, some examples being chau rather than chigai, yoke, many, rather than takusan, okini, thanks, rather than arigato, and maido instead of
Maido,
konnichiwa
kini.
as the most common general greeting. One piece of slang that spread into other regions is omoroi, as a faster omoshiroi. Additionally, dropping
Omoroi.
particles is more common, which also contributes to Kansai Ben's faster pace. In the example here, the particles ni, te, wa,
I hate
and po are
ne.
omitted because there's enough context to understand the sentence clearly without them.
7月東京行こう言ってたん誰や思う7月に東京に行こうって言ってたのは誰だと思う
There isn't really any particle that would follow Shichigatsu or Tokyo other than ni, since the verb itol makes it clear the sentence is about traveling. One of the other most
That's
notable
Tokyo.
differences that standard Japanese speakers hear in Kansai Ben is pitch accent. Tokyo pitch patterns generally sound somewhat flat, most commonly rising a little bit on an early syllable, and either staying high throughout or falling a bit later.
東京忙しい
Many words and extended phrases in Kansai start and stay high throughout, which is almost never seen in standard. It sounds whimsical or even musical.
こうたろか邪魔せんといて
One of the few aspects of Kansai Ben that decrease its pace is its lack of vowel reduction. Word final vowels in frequent words like des, mas, ich, and rok are often dropped in Tokyo dialect, but maintained in Kansai.
1、2、3、4、5、6
1、2、3、4、5、6
There are also a few equivalent conjugations that are shorter, like the 6 more tabenakatta in standard Japanese, versus Kansai's 7 more tabehenkatta. Adjectives can use nai or arahen, and thus end up longer if the latter is chosen. Overall, Osaka Ben is definitely at
Wait,
least
what? Really? But I don't do that. No. Yaso Arahen?
and thus end up longer if the latter is chosen. Adjectives can use nai or arahen, and thus end up longer if the latter is chosen. Overall, Osaka Ben is definitely at least a little bit faster than standard Japanese. Last minute lightning round. Kansai Ben uses instead of to mean good, but still irregularly conjugates it to yoi.
ええな
Iru, another essential verb, is instead oru, and teiru ended up contracted to toru.
小さなおる
Funny because these are all standard Japanese too. Oru is standard.
Vowels are considered breathier, and a lot of the time get extended at the ends of words, usually written with a small kana.
ははき
は
き
Honma is
Ki.
used instead of honto to mean really or seriously.
Honmani.
Akan is used instead of ikenai or dame to mean no good. And McDonald's is abbreviated to makudo instead of maku. That panel from earlier where Osaka calls it Mickey D's is actually what they're talking about in the original as well. It's awesome. Stereotypes are one of the main things we associate with specific ways of speaking. Kansai and Osaka more specifically have their own plethora of cultural associations and assumptions held by other Japanese speakers. Despite being almost identical linguistically, the dialects of Kyoto and Osaka are seen by outsiders very differently and evoke opposite feelings. While the Kyoto dialect was described by responders as polite, calm, elegant, beautiful, and suitable for a young girl, Osaka's was perceived as sloppy,
What?
loud, aggressive, and
What's that
inappropriate for a
last
young girl.
part?
In 2007, more than 20% of students from Tokyo described the Osaka dialect as funny, attractive, and scary, 10% as masculine, and 5% as cute and cool. The Kyoto dialect turned out to be charming, feminine, and refined, and also mild, warm, and attractive. That rough, macho impression is the product of various cultural trends dating back to the Edo period. Osaka's central location and deep water port made it a natural hub of commerce, and the merchants and traders who called it home have left a deep impression on the city's customs and image. Various distinct greetings and slang terms have to do with commerce. For example, maido, every time, from shop owners greeting regular customers, and mo karimaka, from an old way of asking if someone's been making money lately. There's a general vibe that Osaka is friendlier and less elitist compared to Tokyo, and that might have something to do with their opposing statuses during the Edo period. In spite of their wealth, Osakan merchants were legally no different from commoners, and thus looked down upon by the ruling military class. To the high and mighty samurai of the capital, Osakan merchants were greedy and self-serving. Haggling has never been a custom present in Kanto, but remains reasonably common in Kansai. More broadly, samurai were just chuds obsessed with titles and formality, and Osaka's population being 97% non-samurai, in comparison to Edo being split 50-50, meant it would have been seen as a land of unrefined boors. Osaka's place in Edo period literature has also reverberated through to the present. Merchants wrote and patronized many novels in their mother tongue, producing a vibrant but distinctive and even stigmatized literary tradition. By the end of the Edo period, it also became a target of satirical novelists from other regions, who created its stereotypical image. Characters speaking the Osaka dialect were portrayed as talkative, funny, and cheerful, but also miserly, greedy, vulgar, gluttonous, and loud. In the past 80 years, new forms of media have created new stereotypes. Yakuza movies set in Osaka brought a criminal flavor to the dialect's previous association with the rough and tumble city. Most of Japan's established Yakuza organizations are in the country's west, and 6 out of 24 in Kansai specifically. This includes the Yamaguchi-gumi, the single largest by far, based very close by in Kobe. However, the most significant recent cultural development regarding the Kansai dialect has been its role in modern Japanese comedy culture. Nationwide, there are many popular and recognizable Osaka manzai comedy duos and groups, and that's produced a strong association between the city's dialect and humor. While being funny and witty are generally positive stereotypes, the crude and down-to-earth language often employed by Osakan comedians has contributed to an image of Osakans themselves as unrefined or unserious. Kansai is possibly the strongest regional identity in Japan, owing to its historical significance and also local pride in the dialect. As mentioned earlier, it's the region that's best been able to resist the push for linguistic homogenization by the central government. When moving to Tokyo for education or work, most people from outside Kanto choose to mask their local dialect in order to fit in. Kansai residents are seen as very vocal exceptions, and this linguistic pride has been solidified as another stereotype. Despite that, Kansai-ben speakers often employ code switching between it and standard Japanese due to the latter's perceived greater formality. Generally, local dialects in Japan are seen as the domain of friendly face-to-face speech, while cultural institutions from Tokyo have enforced an image of its tongue as the formal standard. For example, books written by authors from Kansai with main characters who speak Osaka or Kyoto-ben will still have narration in standard Japanese. Several food dishes seen as somewhat unusual are strongly associated with Kansai, namely okonomiyaki pancakes and takoyaki octopus dumplings. Additionally, tourists from Tokyo traveling to Osaka who try out Japanese staple meals will experience them slightly differently, since ingredients like soy sauce and dashi broth are manufactured differently, creating a lighter flavor. The confluence of all these things has produced the main cliché image of Osakans found in the media of Tokyo. They're loud, funny, friendly in a blunt way, constantly think about money, have to deal with yakuza, eat takoyaki regularly, and will make sure you know they're from Kansai and won't stop speaking their dialect if they move somewhere else. If all that sounds like the opposite of a certain someone, there's a good reason for that. Osaka from Azumanga Daio's entire character is meant to be a subversion, the polar opposite of a stereotypical Osakan. She's quiet, polite, doesn't really understand humor, is very passive and relaxed, talks slowly, and doesn't have an especially strong accent, all of which are the opposite of what the other main characters expected prior to meeting her. Kiyohiko Azuma is from central Hyogo prefecture, and possibly was raised with Chugoku dialect, Kansai-ben, or something in between. So in summary, there are quite a few major differences between Kansai and Tokyo Japanese, both as functional languages and as signifiers of cultural habits. Linguistically, its most important distinctions are in its vocabulary, conjugation, intonation, and overall pace. The gap between Kansai-ben and standard Japanese is bigger than the gap between, for example, American English and British received pronunciation, but smaller than the difference between those two dialects and fully fledged languages like Scots or Nigerian Pidgin. In my opinion, the dialect of English that most closely parallels Kansai-ben's relationship with standard Japanese from a linguistic perspective is African American Vernacular English. Stay with me here. Disclaimer that there are quite a few regional differences in
Scots is too far. African American. I do know it's an American saying this. But I don't know what the fuck Av is, or what he's referring to as Av.
Vernacular English. Stay with me here. Disclaimer that there are quite a few regional differences in Black American English, and I'm only focusing on the iconic features shared across most of them. As mentioned earlier, one of Kansai-ben's most distinctive features is its different manner of negation, the affixes hen, arahen, and chao. That's also visible to some extent in AAVE, with its unique uses of ain't and double negation being somewhat foreign to other English dialects. You can also draw a parallel between Osakan particle dropping and the omissions in AAVE of am, be, and is, known as null copula, alongside its possessive apostrophe s condition. Kansai's distinct pitch accent intonation is also paralleled in AAVE, with its alternate stress patterns found in words like police or hotel or guitar. Additionally, many people observe AAVE sounding especially musical or sing-songy, owing to those unique stress patterns and pervasive melodic movement in everyday speech. It's hard to say, but I'd estimate AAVE and Kansai-ben speakers both use distinctive vocabulary about as much as each other. I've gotten the impression that Kansai slang terms are pretty distinctive and obvious when encountered by other Japanese speakers, while the adoption of AAVE terms by other English speakers is notoriously so pervasive that their source and original connotations get lost rapidly. On the other hand, AAVE has quite a lot of phonetic differences from general American English, unlike Osaka-ben and standard Japanese. Aside from the earlier mentioned SH shifts that happened in Kansai for some words, there aren't any parallels to AAV's phonetic characteristics, like nasalizing vowels, replacing TH dental fricatives with D or F, or being non-rhotic.
What? I hate round 14. It keeps happening.
Across English dialects.
Let me just play the game.
Long enough to the point that they're considered separate words with their own spellings. There's also no parallel to AAV's unique use of the word be to refer to regular or repeated processes, known by linguists as habitual be, nor its word order differences from other English varieties. In short, it's certainly not a perfect analogy, but someone from Tokyo listening to Kansai-ben without prior knowledge would understand about as much as other English speakers encountering African American English. A lot of words are different, some are omitted, and intonation is wildly altered, but overall, mutual understanding is easily attainable with a bit of context. However, there's one big issue with using AAVE for localizing Kansai speech, and it's the obvious fact that Osakans aren't considered a separate race from the rest of Japan. There are some cultural similarities, like how they're both considered informal and less refined by speakers of more prestigious varieties, but overall, equating them for those linguistic parallels would be ill-advised because of how different they are culturally. Historic working-class accents of northeastern American cities also share some of AAVE's stigmatization, but happen to culturally line up with Osakan stereotypes much better. New York works especially well in this regard. Like Osaka, its history as a commercial center has shaped every part of its culture and urban fabric. Traditional Brooklyn and Manhattanites are stereotyped as fast talkers trying to get by in an even faster city. Mafia stories set in New York and Jersey have given their accents a strong association with masculine, blunt, and violent characters, similar to the grittier side of Osakan stereotypes. New York also has the claim to being the most significant city in American comedy, with notable comics like Nick Mullen, Adam Friedland, and the fat one all calling it home. The biggest issue with equating them is that in the modern era, Osaka has always played second fiddle to Tokyo, while New York has been America's largest city since independence. It's also just too similar to general American English. Part of the charm of hearing Kansai-ben for Tokyo audiences is just how different it is. Its distinct vocabulary and grammar, especially use of ya, results in most sentences being compositionally different from standard Japanese, while those features are much more muted between American accents. There's also a disconnect in how continued use of those dialects are seen in the present. New York has always been a city of immigrants and transplants, and its local accents have been on a relative decline for decades. There's a sort of novelty in hearing strong and authentic traditional American accents, even in locations where they were formerly dominant. If you go to Brooklyn and hear someone speaking like Vinny Gambini, or someone who sounds like Scout in Boston, it'd be surprising and interesting. If you go to Osaka and hear people speaking Osaka-ben in public, it's completely mundane. I honestly don't know why the rural white southern accent was equated with Osakan Japanese. The only features shared between them are the recognizability among other dialects and the fact that they're seen as lower class. Other than that, their stereotypes completely clash. Kansai-ben is fundamentally linked to Osaka's history as an urban and commercial center, while the southern drawl is linked to agrarian slaver aristocracy and poor manual laborers. The only possible reason I can think of is genuinely Azumanga Daioh, since the company that made its official dub was located in Houston. The first official translation of the manga was done by the same company, opting to give her that New York accent, but when it came time to adapt the anime, they backtracked and recruited a local voice actress. Since this was back during the Stone Age, with so much less translated anime existing, and all the other long-term influence of Azumanga Daioh, the convention of equating the southern drawl to Kansai-ben starting with it is definitely believable. Around the same time, Funimation, also based in Texas, did the dub for Detective Conan, but as far as I can tell, they didn't give Heiji any distinct accent. Speaking of, that's the last approach for translating Japanese dialects, casting the same net for all characters, regardless of what region they're from. Scott Streichart, former localization director for the Yakuza series, has discussed in depth the issues of translating Kansai-ben and the variety of other dialects present in-game. Specifically, whether or not equating them with individual English accents is even worthwhile in the first place. Between games, Kansai-ben's localization treatment switched between having no specific accent, Southern, back to being accent blind, in consideration for a New York-based dub, before settling on all characters speaking American English but with personal flair and stylization. In the first game, Mark Hale as Majima just kind of speaks weird.
I'm doing this because he disrespected you. Alright, if you say so.
But all the games released between 2006 and 2017 lack English dubs. The next few games gave him a southern accent and subtitles. Streichart talks about how for the sub-exclusive games after that, he developed a really specific style for Majima that no one else on the team could replicate. For 2020's Like a Dragon, which also features other Japanese dialects, the team abandoned equating them to individual English accents, using conventional American voice actors and freestyling on a character-by-character basis. Something I haven't brought up until now are the real logistical difficulties involved in employing voice actors bearing specific accents. Quoting Streichart, when an accent is that large scale, the only good way to do it is to use a studio in the region you want to base the accent off. Let's say I wanted Brooklyn. I'd need to split the work between an LA and New York-based studio and a New York-based cast to realistically pull it off. I'm not working with Rockstar budgets, and even if I was, and it did land, I'd be setting up the series to have to fly out to New York every time? Utterly unsustainable, if not irresponsible. More broadly, all these issues and questions regarding dialects kind of miss the forest for the trees, since Japanese-English localization is already such an open-ended and complicated process with so much information lost. There's technically nuance smoothed over every time an Osakan character says okini instead of arigato, and localizers choose to just translate it as a nondescript thanks, but how much does that matter when localization already has to smooth over major features of standard Japanese? A character canonically speaking Kansai-ben is ultimately an artistic choice, usually because the author wants to associate them with one of Osaka or Kyoto's many stereotypes, or for a more grounded and personal connection to the region. Or maybe the character is just fucking crazy and speaks broken Kansai-ben to be funny. Non-Japanese audiences just don't have the exposure required to understand the intent behind those references, and that goes both ways. Dubbing Seinfeld or Cheers in Kansai-ben has merits that you can argue for, but if a viewer isn't familiar with New York or Boston, then that alone won't go far to educate them, and it'd be a major expense for a Tokyo-based company to justify. I have my gripes with how the Azumanga Daioh dub handled Osaka, but ultimately can acknowledge it was a pragmatic choice given the circumstances. Priority number one for a target American audience is highlighting the fact that she speaks differently from the main cast, and that's definitely accomplished. I also don't even watch dubs, so my opinion basically doesn't matter, except come to think of it, if she spoke like Livia Soprano, I'd absolutely watch it. That sounds incredible. I'm not a fucking imposter, what are you talking about? A real Jerseyite would bring gabagool in their lunchbox.
I wish the Lord would take me now.
Thank you for watching. Major thanks to my first patrons, Ivo and Voidworm. I'll be including a unique image for each patron's name at the end until that becomes unsustainable and takes up too much space. I also just set up YouTube memberships, and they're gonna have the same rewards, early previews, ad-free uploads, names, credits, and other things I sporadically will add when I feel like it. Additional regards to Dr. Hanna Jaskiewicz of Nicolaus Copernicus University, whose article, The Portrayal of the Osaka Dialect and Speakers, was a very crucial source for Chapter 2. It's from a paid academic journal, but she was kind enough to provide it for free when I emailed asking. This video has been the product of
Wow, you can just ask academics.
As it kept expanding in scope, first from like 18 minutes and now 21 minutes and now 25 minutes closer to, I've had to keep revising like my estimated finish date. I wanted it to be done on Friday and then like mid-Saturday, and now it is like, it's now Tuesday. All of that previous stuff in the outro I recorded on Saturday because I expected to be done by Sunday. My motivation to work on any given day has been all over the place, but I'm definitely learning that there are patterns to it. Like, I worked pretty consistently from Sunday the 19th to Saturday the 25th, but I was way less efficient on Saturday because I had just been burnt out by that time. So I was able to take the next Sunday off and then get a decent amount done yesterday, and now I'm finally close to being done today, Tuesday. I have a poll up right now for the next video topic. I doubt the winner will change because it has 70% right now, but we'll see. This one hopefully will actually be kept in scope and only be around 10 minutes. Thank you, have a great day.
Well. Yeah, that was cool.
A horse-drawn buggy when he was young, so he couldn't really walk properly. He had to swing his hip, his right hip around, in order to walk. And so there's no footage of Stalin walking or moving extant in any Soviet archive. It was forbidden to film it. There are only a few tiny clips of him in Potsdam where they show him walking very slowly. So you can see the hip movement. When he was in his office, especially when he was agitated, he was always up. There was in his working office, he had two offices. His working office in the Kremlin had a very big table, sat about 20 or so, a big piece of felt. On the top of it, his seat was not the head of the table, but the first seat on the side of the table, but he was rarely ever sitting in it. Everyone else was seated, but he paced, and he would do his pacing. Sometimes he would stop right in front of somebody's face. Sometimes he would stop not in front of their face, but right behind them. And of course, they would have to continue speaking or not moving while he was standing behind them. It was unnerving for them. It was just a common practice for him. I don't necessarily think he was trying to do something with these movements or with standing or stopping in front of people or behind them. It was just something he developed. So since I started writing this book, I've begun to pace. I'm going to pace a little bit today. I know they're filming this on camera, and I'm causing them great difficulty. But that's not intentional. And anyway, we'll see whether it's worthwhile, all the filming efforts that they're undertaking. Well, a 906-page text is difficult to deliver in a 45-minute talk, and I'm not going to try to do that. You'll be relieved that I won't try to do that. So instead, I'm going to present a few episodes from the book, which I consider interesting, and we'll see if you share that view when I'm done. But any question is open for discussion if I don't mention it in this short presentation. So if you want to talk about how Stalin managed the culture, if you want to talk about the collectivization of agriculture, if you want to talk about the terror, the mass terror of 1936-38, or if you just want to ask personal questions about what type of person he was. I'm not going to speak to those issues here in the presentation, but once again, for the Q&A period, any of that and more. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the geopolitical aspect of the book. And
I'll never get tired of this game.
First, let me set the stage before I get into the book, and then let me deliver a few pieces of this from the book, and then we'll do the Q&A. So there is a big story in world history which has to do with the rise of British power. The British and the French fought about 100 years war, more or less, for supremacy, and the British won. This was very unexpected that the British won. The victory of the British was sort of symbolized by the defeat of Napoleon, especially the second defeat of Napoleon. So by 1815, you have a clearly British-dominated world. The British then go on to form a global economy, which is pretty remarkable. Global trade, first globalization. Pound sterling is more than 90% of reserve currency in global transactions. The British lay the cables under the sea. They're responsible for the global communications. And we can give other examples of the nature of the British-dominated world. But then a few things happen, eruptions in this British-dominated world. One is the Bismarck's unification of Germany, which is how the first volume, which I'm not talking about tonight, the first volume opens up with Bismarck's unification of Germany. This creates a new power on the continent, which deeply alters the balance of power. And the German state, as you know, after 1870-71, goes on to a fantastic industrialization spurt and becomes better than the British at certain high-end industrial manufacturing processes. The other piece, the other eruption, is Meiji Restoration in Japan. Unlike the German case, this is not the creation of a new state, but this is the consolidation of a centralized state, which, as in the German case, goes on to this fantastic industrial story and is clearly now in the ranks of the first powers, major power in the world, but which Japan wasn't prior to the Meiji Restoration. So these two eruptions in the British-dominated world create very significant challenges for British power, because British power is global. It has aspirations to be a major power, not just in its neighborhood, but also throughout East Asia. And it's worried, as I said, about the balance of power on the European continent. So the German and Japanese story are things the British feel they need to confront in some fashion. There's a piece I'm leaving out, which is the trajectory of the United States after the victory of the North in the Civil War. This destroys the slave-based economy of the South for the most part, which was far richer than the North, and opens the way to a railroad-driven industrial manufacturing model for the U.S., which is the model that's going to spread across the continent. And this is going to be the largest economy in the world, at least by the 1890s, but not yet a major arbiter of the international system. Global trade is a small percentage of U.S. GDP, maybe 5% in 1900, even though the U.S. is the biggest economy. But the U.S. has this huge continental market and is able to aggrandize predominantly without interacting in a big way with the rest of the world. There are important episodes that we'll know about, Philippines and other things, but nonetheless, these are not the dominant. The dominant thing is the U.S. is not significantly trying to manage or interfere in global affairs the way it will later on. So they're looming, the US power is looming over the international system. Already by 1916, the US begins to build a navy, both for the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously, which tells you just how powerful this looming US presence is going to be, the idea of building that navy to compete on both sides of the world. Anyway, but for right now, it's a story of a British-dominated world, which will eventually give way to the United States, and then this eruption of German power and eruption of Japanese power. This is especially salient for Russia, because Russia obviously is flanked by Germany and Japan. So to the extent that Russia has aspirations to be a great power itself, as well as security challenges, it's now the challenges are now much greater because of the German and Japanese stories, one on either side of Russia. So that's just by way of introduction. So forgive me how simplified that is. There's a lot I'm leaving out. You know, that's a kind of geopolitics 101 in its most simplified fashion. There's a lot more nuance that's necessary. There are a lot of other pieces that I need to introduce in that. I need to talk about global political economy, commodity prices, who's feeding the world, where the minerals are being extracted from. There's a whole lot of other stuff that I just don't have time to fill in, but could fill in if this were, for example, the entire year or semester course, where I normally give these kind of lectures. Okay. So now let's bring in, I'm setting up for this Stalin and geopolitics stuff. Now let's bring in another piece. Another piece is World War I. And as you know, Germany, Austria-Hungary, eventually Turkey, so-called Central Powers, Ottoman Empire, not Turkey, Ottoman Empire, versus Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States, right? And the Germans win the war on the Eastern Front. In March 1918, they signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which just this month is having its 100th anniversary. German victory on the Eastern Front. The Germans, however, lose the war on the Western Front, coming within 37 miles of Paris. They're unable to finish the job on the Western Front, as a result of which the Brest-Litovsk Treaty is repudiated. In any case, then there is the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. You're all familiar with the Versailles Peace of 1919, and that treaty is subject to tremendous criticism. You can almost never find anybody who's going to defend the Versailles Peace. And there are two arguments against the Versailles Peace. One argument is that it was a punitive peace, singled out Germany as the only culprit for World War I, blamed everything, in other words, on Germany, and then made Germany pay reparations. This excessively punitive quality to the peace then contributed to the destabilization of the Weimar Republic, the rise of Hitler, Nazism, and World War II. It's a very powerful critique. It's very widely shared. There's another critique of the Versailles Treaty, which is less widely shared, which is about how, this is more a conservative critique, which is more about how the British and the French shrank from imposing the treaty. In other words, if the British and the French just had more resolve, more willpower to uphold the treaty, there wouldn't have been this World War II. They would have cut that off before it happened. And so the blame is on not the peace treaty being too punitive, but the failure to enforce it. So my argument is that both of these views of the Versailles Treaty are wrong. And the reason I argue that is because the Versailles Treaty was an anomaly. It happened in 1919 only because this was the only time since Bismarck's unification of Germany where both German power and Russian power were flat on their back. You could predict confidently that either Germany or Russia would rise again to be a great power. And in fact, both of them rose again to be great powers within a single generation. And so the Versailles Peace Treaty could not have been enforced no matter what. It could only have been imposed at that moment and could not be imposed again or enforced later on. Okay. We have something like that with the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was a post-1991 settlement which was imposed on Russia. Russia could do nothing about that settlement in 1991, but it can do something about that settlement now. Right? Okay. So anyway, the Versailles Treaty. So now let's move to the period in between World War I and World War II, where we have a British-dominated world, the rise of German power and Japanese power. This has led to this Anglo-German antagonism, which has helped produce World War I. The Japanese are really not major participants in World War I, not in the battle sense, but they are participants in the sense of benefiting from the new geopolitical order. In any case, now we enter the interwar period. And the most remarkable thing about the interwar period, I'm going to talk about British geopolitics and Soviet geopolitics, and then bring the Hitler-Stalin piece after that. So the most remarkable thing about the British policy is that the British began to revise the Versailles Treaty themselves almost immediately. If you know the Genoa Conference from 1922, Genoa was already an attempt to alter the terms of Versailles, to bring the Germans back into a settlement. Right? Remember, the Versailles Peace Treaty was imposed on the Germans, dictated to them, and excluded Russia, now Soviet Russia. They weren't even invited to the table. And so the 1922 Genoa Conference was this attempt. You can argue that it was cynical, it was only partial, it was confused, it was poorly executed, but nonetheless it shows a recognition on the British side that the Versailles order was not itself stable, and they needed to have an order where Germany was actually on the inside rather than a pariah state. And in fact, another goal of Genoa was maybe even to feel out Soviet Russia to see if they could be included and further stabilize the order after World War I. What happened instead was that Germany and Soviet Russia cut a deal on the sidelines of Genoa at a place called Rapallo. If you know your Italian geography, it's not that far from Genoa. That's in fact where the German delegation was based. and so just outside of Rapallo, and so they cut this deal as the two pariah states.
Oh, you're
against Versailles.
joking. I can't
But
make
the
that
British
straight.
didn't cease attempting
That wall
to
is
revise
so
the Versailles
annoying.
Treaty. The entire interwar period,
Stops a lot of cool
the
things
British
from being
attempted
able to
to get to a
happen.
better
Makes
place,
the map
to
much
get to a
harder.
settlement that involved Germany accepting the peace or the settlement in a way that
Which
they
means
wouldn't try to
it's
revise
really
what they
good
did.
because you have to play around it massively.
I'll finish that thought. I want to just break now to the Soviet version of this and then show you their interaction.
I'm pretty sure nades can't
So these are
interact
arguments
with. They have no headphones.
On the Soviet
In
side,
Rubio one?
we have a poor understanding, in my view, of Soviet geopolitics. Well, Soviet geopolitics was as follows. And how do we know this? Because Stalin wrote in December 1924, sort of published in January 1925, an article called Socialism in One Country. You've probably heard the slogan, Socialism in One Country, and you've heard it because Trotsky denounced the slogan of Socialism in One Country 2 years after Stalin first published it. And Trotsky tendentiously mischaracterized Stalin's argument, and then Trotsky's version of Stalin's argument has entered into the literature. The argument of socialism in one country was, should we build socialism in one country now, given that the world revolution hasn't happened yet, or should we surrender to the capitalists and give up the attempt to build socialism in one country? And the answer to that was obvious. It was a rhetorical question. The answer was, of course, we should build socialism in the one country in which it's happened. In fact, Lenin had said this himself before he died in January 1924, and Trotsky is on paper saying the same thing. Who would surrender and give up the revolution? The world revolution hasn't happened yet. Should we surrender? No. Let's build socialism in one country first, or now, as we wait or try to instigate the world revolution. So Trotsky then, 2 years later, there was a fiasco over China policy, where Chiang Kai-shek began to murder communists in the United Front, which humiliated Stalin. This is in volume 1 of my Stalin book. In any case, I'll skip that, but the upshot of that was Trotsky then began to dredge up all the tools he could use against Stalin. Stalin had many more tools than Trotsky had at his command. Stalin had censorship and control over the public sphere. Stalin was a master at the smear and the tendentious mischaracterization of others' arguments. So it's kind of ironic that Trotsky is using this against Stalin, and that we now have this perverted notion of socialism in our country. That's not why this is important, however. Why I think this is important is because Stalin laid out a theory of Soviet geopolitics in the same little article. It was a preface, actually, to other stuff. And what he said was, it wasn't just class struggle that produced socialist revolution. It was also imperialist war. And without the special imperialist war factor, you might not have got socialist revolution in the Russian case. And so therefore, Soviet geopolitics or Soviet foreign policy is as follows. Prevent the capitalists from forming a coalition and ganging up on us, and instead try to instigate them fighting each other. And if they would fight each other, they might destroy each other, and socialist revolution might happen in the capitalist world, while we, the socialists in one country, would be protected. So anything we could do to prevent an anti-Soviet, all-capitalist, or what Stalin called all-imperialist coalition. It's a simple idea, and he held to this idea throughout the 1930s. This is the governing idea of Soviet geopolitics. We have multiple evidence about how Stalin understands this theory and how he elaborates this theory over time, sticking to the fundamentals. So this meant that if the British goal was to bring the Germans in to stabilize the Versailles Order, the Soviet goal was to keep the Germans out as pariahs, so as to prevent, in the Soviet mind, all the Versailles powers, all those imperialists getting together and attacking the Soviets. So there's a kind of contest for Germany's attention. The British want Germany, not because they want to attack and destroy the Soviet Union, but they're afraid of Germany being outside the system, destabilizing the Versailles Order and potentially overturning it. The Soviets, as I say, Stalin articulated this, Foreign Affairs Commissar Georgy Chicherin articulated this, Maxim Litvinov articulated the same theory. It's throughout the Soviet documentation. Soviet documentations are saturated with this. Okay. And so from the Soviet side, trying to, like that Rapallo Treaty, trying to bring the Germans over to their side, not necessarily because, or not only because the Germans and the Soviets might have things in common, like trade, or a deep economic relationship, but just to prevent Germany, France, and Britain all ganging up, all forming one side. All right. So lo and behold, Hitler comes to power in January 1933. This is a big story. We're going to skip the reasons for that story today, but we can discuss those in the Q&A if you're interested, because Stalin makes an unwitting contribution to the rise of Hitler. He's not predominantly responsible by any stretch of the imagination, but he makes his contribution. In any case, the rise of Hitler, the rise of Nazism, the Nazi regime, does not alter either British geopolitics or Soviet geopolitics.
This whole time.
The British continue the same policy under different governments of trying to make a deal with the Germans and keep the Germans inside the order. This leads, as you know, to the infamous Munich Pact in 1938, but it's a continuous policy that you can see in Genoa in 1922. Once again, it's not identical, because Lloyd George and Neville Chamberlain are different people, different parties, right? There are important nuances here. But in general terms, even the rise of Hitler doesn't fundamentally alter British geopolitics in the interwar period. Moreover, from the Soviet side, that's also true. The rise of Hitler, a Nazi regime proclaiming itself, right, as the scourge of, quote, Judeo-Bolshevism, Jewish Bolshevism, proclaiming itself as wanting living space to take away the territory and the livelihoods of Slavs living to the east of Germany. Proclaiming all of this, and yet Soviet geopolitics remains to try to do a deal with Germany to prevent an all-imperialist coalition ganging up on the Soviets. This is breathtaking. Because on the one hand, the British, who are a parliamentary system, are trying to get in bed with the Nazis. And on the other hand, the Soviet Union, which is communism and completely antagonistic to the Nazi regime and vice versa, are trying to get in bed with Nazism. But from a geopolitical standpoint, it does have a logic. And it is continuous with this problem of Versailles, as I've set it down, right? The 1919 being a moment in time, an anomaly that was not going to last and wouldn't repeat. Okay, so I think we're okay on time. Just let me check here. I'm not good sometimes when there's no clock in the room. All right, we started at around 6:40, you said, and it's 7:07. So I'm going to do a little bit more before the Q&A, if that's all right? Okay.
Beautiful.
So there's great drama. This is fantastic drama, this story. There are bigger pieces I'm leaving out here. Now we have the Japanese case, right, which I haven't talked much about. As you know, Japan seizes those northeastern provinces of China that used to be called Manchuria and creates a puppet state, Manchukuo. The seizure happens in fall 1931, and Manchukuo was formed in early spring 1932. This fundamentally changes the balance of power in East Asia. And the Soviet Stalin begins an express militarization of his economy, which David Stone has proven in his magnificent book on the first 5-year plan, that the Soviet economy was already geared up to be able to produce the industrial base, right, that undergirded a military-industrial complex. But now Stalin begins to build an express military-industrial complex, and he's goaded by the Japanese seizure of Manchuria and creation of the puppet state Manchukuo. So I've left that out, but that's a really big piece, because in the anti-Soviet all-imperialist coalition, you got to also keep the Japanese out of that coalition. Right? And the British are stretched and unable necessarily to protect their possessions in Asia, and so the British are trying to do a deal with Japan in a kind of split the responsibilities for Asia with Japan. And so this is another interesting wrinkle. Once again, it would be necessary to go into further detail about this in order to flesh it all out. I'm leaving out the Spanish Civil War and all the mythologies about the Spanish Civil War. I'm leaving out Chiang Kai-shek and the communists in China, also another important contributing factor at the forefront of decision-making. And all elaborated at length in the book with the primary documents and available for a Q&A. But I just want to do this Hitler-Stalin pact and then the invasion, the onset of the invasion in the little time that I've got left, since that's what I've set up. All right. Now, so it's not a shock that Stalin is trying to do a deal with Hitler. Because once again, the British are trying to do the same thing. So you actually have a kind of Neville Chamberlain, Joseph Stalin competition for Hitler's favor and attention.
And I accidentally full-boarded one of the windows.
We make fun of Chamberlain. He's the easiest person in the world to mock. First of all, he's a Tory. That is to say, he's conservative. So there's all the material you need right there. Secondly, he has a giant big nose.
What?
He's got that ridiculous top hat.
I mean, based, but what?
And he's got that umbrella, right, which he uses as a cane as he walks. And then he comes back from handing over Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland for free, with no compensation to Hitler, handing it to Hitler on a silver platter, and he comes back from that and says, we've now achieved peace in our time.
Come on!
Right, so that's immortal. You can't wipe that away. That's a stain. You know, Trump isn't there yet. That's how big that stain is of Chamberlain. But here's the interesting thing about Chamberlain. Of all the mistakes he made, of all the oversights and stupidities and opportunities he missed, he had this to say in 1938-39. His critics were saying, you know, we need to do a deal with the Soviet Union to combat this guy Hitler and defeat him in a war. That's what Chamberlain's critics were arguing was a better policy than trying to do a deal with Hitler, come to an understanding, a policy known as appeasement, which has become an infamous word but wasn't an infamous word back then. And so the opposite of Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, of doing a deal, was do the deal with Stalin and crush Hitler. And Chamberlain said, fine, to his critics, fine, if I do that, explain this to me. If we do that and we win, we're successful, which would be the aim, how do I then get communism out of Central Europe? That's Chamberlain, 1938-39. And you got to say to yourself, yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, that's called the Cold War. And if you were alive during the Cold War, you know it was serious business. So Chamberlain may have been an nincompoop, and we may make fun of him as much as we want, but there was a fundamental dilemma here, which Chamberlain at least understood, and his critics didn't. And so, okay, now let's move to the Stalin-Hitler piece. So in all the dealings where Stalin is trying to get Hitler's attention, Hitler is not interested. Hitler's economists, his economic ministers, are interested because they're seeing the buildup of German power.
Round 14 is definitely my last round. So is round 23. I go every day round 24.
You name it, like the whole periodic table. And the Soviet Union's got all that. And moreover, the Soviets are thirsty for high-end manufacturing, precision engineering goods, as well as armaments. And Germany is state-of-the-art on that kind of stuff. Not always as good as Britain and France in, for example, aircraft manufacture, but still pretty good. And so there's sort of mutually beneficial trade possible between the two countries. So his economic team, Hitler's economic team, is interested in these feelers from the Soviet Union. And moreover, there are some Anglophobes in Hitler's inner circle who also hate hate England so much that they would even prefer a deal with the Judeo-Bolsheviks. But Hitler himself is not very interested. But all of a sudden, after all Stalin's feelers, Stalin has killed a lot of the people he had extend the feelers by now. All of a sudden, in July 1939, Hitler's interested. And the reason is because he's given the order to attack Poland, to invade and destroy Poland. And the British and the French finally have publicly stated that they will defend Poland's sovereignty. And so they'll declare war on Germany if Germany invades Poland. Hitler is not quite sure if the British and the French are for real on this. Do they mean it? But nonetheless, it's a gamble. Because if the Soviets join with the British and the French, the Germans now have the problem of the two-front war that they lost in World War I. So all of a sudden, with the war plans already green-lighted and the invasion date already set for Poland, Hitler decides that the feelers from Stalin, he's now going to respond to. This is July 1939. Before July 1939, Stalin's got nothing, almost no response. The responses from Germany are contradictory because, as I say, parts of the bureaucracy are interested, but Hitler himself is against it. So the bureaucracy engages in a couple of talks here and there with Soviet representatives. Hitler finds out and cuts the talks off. All right. But now all of a sudden it's Hitler who's the motivator, who's the driver of this. And so Stalin, who is privy to Hitler's attack plans of Poland because of the Soviet spy network,
15 was
and understands
easy as fuck.
that Hitler now has a timetable and for the attack and doesn't want to change the timetable and therefore doesn't have a lot of leverage, Stalin plays it slow. Oh, really? Now you're interested? Well, I'm going to play hard to get. Right? If you've done any negotiations in business,
Tomorrow I don't think I'm
marriage,
gonna
or whatever,
play
you
this,
understand how these things work.
I want to get
So
another
we
20
understand how
for you
one
today.
side
No,
tries to use
20.
leverage.
It's another 20 for me.
Okay, so Hitler has handed leverage to Stalin. That's what he's done. So Stalin plays it slow. Hitler then begins to get very agitated. I need a deal. I need a deal. I mean, the invasion of Poland is coming up. It's set for late August. It's now early August. It's now mid-August. So Hitler asks Stalin if he would receive his foreign minister, Nazi foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop in Moscow. And finally, Stalin agrees.
Oh,
Yes, and so the meeting takes
Molotov-Ribbentrop
place in late
pact?
August 1939, and the invasion of Poland is put off for a little bit of time, like a week. So von Ribbentrop is now coming to the Soviet Union to negotiate a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in order to keep the Soviets out of a potential war with the British and the French against Germany over Poland. And if the Soviets are out, maybe the British and French won't have the resolve to take Hitler on, so maybe he'll get Poland and the British and the French will just be bluffing. So it looks like a deal for Hitler, too. Anyway, so Stalin tells almost nobody that this is going on. The whole thing's a secret. He's a conspirator, and he's conspiring this deal with Hitler. And so they're at the dacha, where they gathered in the evening, as you know if you've seen the films. And there's this little guy who's a protege of Stalin, fantastically loyal, worships Stalin. Stalin has a perverse sense of humor, however, so he says to this guy whose name was Nikita Khrushchev, he says Mikita, which is what he called him because that's the Ukrainian version of Nikita. It's a condescending way to say Khrushchev's name because Khrushchev is not ethnic Ukrainian, just happened to be. Party boss now. Anyway, he says Mikita Ribbentrop is coming to Moscow tomorrow. And
Everyone I meet is a
don't know what my last action was, so really annoying. Luckily the M14 is still good if it was back. No. SNN. 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 You know, Numa. I've been hit by that zip line too many times to know. Bad news. I'm actually very curious about warp speed. I should get a velocity meter and test out some of the things, and I think that'll be very useful. So many AI videos, I'll kill myself.
Khrushchev, with the Stalin perverse sense of humor, you know, ha ha ha. And maybe he's going to defect, right? And Stalin says, no, actually, Ribbentrop is coming here to Moscow tomorrow. And Khrushchev doesn't say anything more because he doesn't know if Stalin is joking or testing Khrushchev's loyalty or whatever it might be. But there's a very narrow circle in which this is revealed. So Ribbentrop flies on Hitler's personal plane, known as a Condor, actually two planes because of the entourage. And they're crossing the Soviet border, and of course, Stalin hasn't told the Soviet border guards. And so as Ribbentrop flying on Hitler's plane, which is obviously not registered with the Soviet border guards and is clearly not a Soviet plane, even if you can't read the markings on it, the Soviets don't make Condors like the plane that Ribbentrop is on. So Soviet anti-aircraft fires at the plane.
Oh, that would have been sick!
And it misses. It missed the plane.
And
so Ribbentrop continued on his way, and he landed safely in Moscow. Let's think about this for a second. Let's think about if Soviet anti-aircraft had hit the plane. Stalin says to Ribbentrop, to Hitler, I'm so sorry I killed Ribbentrop. It was an accident. I forgot to tell the border guards. And Hitler's going to believe this, right? He's going to assume that Stalin is telling the truth and hadn't set him up in order to murder his foreign minister. Right? I don't think so. How do you explain that it was an accident? Anyway, so this is the way history works, right? There are all these contingencies and accidents built into the bigger structures. So then Ribbentrop lands in Moscow, and they do this deal, and Stalin dictates the terms of the deal. He changes some of the terms. Hitler is called on the phone. Hitler agrees to the changes, and the deal is wrapped up very, very quickly.
That's so fucking bullshit. The way they were moving, that was
personal photographer.
Okay.
So there are photographs from the Soviet side and from the German side.
Why,
And Hitler sent his personal photographer because he asked him to photograph Stalin's earlobes to see if Stalin had Aryan blood or not. Yeah, so this is this regime, this gigantic regime of German power run by this guy. And so they do the deal, and the deal consists in, I mean, you know the deal, it consists in a non-aggression pact, a deep economic exchange, and then spheres of influence in a so-called secret protocol. And the Germans are now going to invade Poland, which takes place September 1st, 1939. And then the Soviets are going to get a chunk of Poland. Germans are going to get Western Poland. The Soviets are going to get Eastern Poland. That's the deal. Meanwhile, we have this notion that Stalin trusted nobody, but he trusted Hitler. So now we're going to work through that. So Hitler invades September 1st, 1939, and Stalin doesn't know how this is going to go. Poland has an army. Poland has an air force. Britain and France might declare war. They do declare war. They might, I don't know, send troops or start bombing Germany. So Stalin's kind of waiting to see what happens. He's hanging out, and Ribbentrop says, well, where's the Soviet invasion of Poland from the east? How come that's not happening? Not because the Germans need the Soviets to help destroy Poland, but because Ribbentrop is trying to drive the wedge deeper between the British and the French and the Soviets. God forbid the British and the French now should do their own deal with the Soviets, and Stalin should go back on his word with Ribbentrop and now be incorporated into an alliance against Germany, right? So get the Soviets in there to make the breach between Britain and France on the one side and the Soviets deeper. So Stalin is stalling. He's fighting a war with Japan at the time. There is a gigantic border war underway in the Far East. And this border war is going very well for the Soviets, but nonetheless, Stalin is at war with Japan. So there's an order for the Soviets to go into Poland, September 12th.
Beautiful.
It doesn't happen. The order is not, that is to say,
I didn't even need to do that.
It's not signed and executed. Another order 2 days later, and so clearly they were thinking about when they should go in. So finally, September 17th, the Red Army goes into eastern Poland. By now, Poland has been overrun in the west by the Germans, and the British and the French have declared war but done nothing so far. Moreover, the day before, Stalin has signed a truce with the Japanese. The day after the truce, he then sends the army in to Poland. So let's think about this, right? So for a time, both the German army and the Japanese army were in motion towards the Soviet border. Okay. Now, they've drawn this line on a map.
Oh, I hate this. This is so clearly a fucking problem.
But lo and behold,
With that one
a couple
blank,
of days after the Soviets go
because
in,
it wasn't doing this
September
before.
18th, 19th, 20th, the Germans
The
are
line,
on
horrible
Stalin's
place
side
tonight.
of the line.
No contingency.
Yeah, that's right. The Wehrmacht
Two downs.
hasn't stopped where Stalin and Ribbentrop
Two
agreed,
downs
but it's on the other side
disarming.
of the line. Moreover,
Fair
Stalin
enough.
sends a minion
Kind of
into
again.
Berlin to meet with German military intelligence, and when the minion shows up, on the table is this huge map which shows the dislocation of forces in Poland and shows that the Germans know that they're on Stalin's side of the line. You know, they have the little stick pins, if you know those old-style maps, right, showing where the tanks and the artillery and the planes are. So imagine Stalin's thinking, right? The Germans know his minion is coming, so if they don't want the minion to see this, they can fold up the map and kind of put it in the drawer. Or they can receive him in another room where there is no map. But they happened to receive him in the room with the map, and the map happened to show that the Wehrmacht had violated the agreement. So Stalin calls in the German military attaché in Moscow, Lieutenant General Ernst Kirstein, who is a fluent Russian speaker. And he says to him, you guys are on my side of the line. And the Lieutenant General says, yes, but it's only temporary. You see, what's happening is we're killing the Poles, and the Poles are fleeing. And as they flee, we're chasing them. And so in order to kill them, we had to cross the line. But as soon as we kill them, we're going to go back to our side of the line. Everything is cool. So think about this. Stalin has a piece of paper with a line drawn on it, signed by this guy Ribbentrop, who in an earlier life was a champagne salesman, and is now the Nazi foreign minister. Moreover, before they've gone into the negotiations, Stalin has ordered up a dossier. He's ordered up a dossier of writings.
Del dossier.
That's
It's
how
the
he
Del
prepares things. He's
dossier.
ordered up a dossier. He got translation of Mein Kampf from German into Russian. Not published, but just for his purposes. He has all his own minions in his regime read this Mein Kampf translation. Khrushchev says he couldn't barely get through it. And that's in part because he was not literate. But it also could be because he was offended. There are these passages which say, for example, Slavic subhumans. There are underlines in Stalin's colored pencil on the Slavic subhumans. There's this passage called Drive to the East, Drang nach Osten. Underlines under those passages.
Oh,
That's pretty clear.
shit!
Stalin's read Mein Kampf, and he's underlined those passages which are directed, threats directed at him from Hitler. So could he really be trusting or fooled? Moreover, there's other stuff in the dossier. There's a biography of Hitler by Konrad Haydn, written in Swiss
Very good,
immigration,
Orange.
excellent biography. There are other documents about how Hitler, other analyses of Hitler in German, translated into Russian for Stalin, about how Hitler signs all these deals, and he never keeps his word. Check mark. So this is the Hitler he knows. He's got this piece of paper with the border, and the Wehrmacht is on the other side of the line. So there's your trust. No guarantee that the Germans will stop at the line that they drew. No guarantee that the Germans will stop at the Polish-Soviet border. Maybe the whole pact itself was a ruse to sucker Stalin in, and maybe the Germans are going to bash him too. I mean, how do you know? So Stalin says to Lieutenant General Ernst Kirstein, he says to him, we're going to go in, and we're going to take the territory that's on our side of the line by force. And Lieutenant General says, you can't do that. We don't need to do that. We're going to just let us finish, and we'll evacuate, and then we'll hand it over. And so Stalin says, dismissed. So several hours later, the Red Army goes in to the province, and the German army, the Wehrmacht, and the Red Army clash. They have a military clash in Poland around the city of Lvov, Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg, which is the same city. It just has these many names in Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, German, and Yiddish. And so there are casualties on both sides, and the Germans are evicted. And in the middle of it, Hitler is informed. He's in Poland himself, adding to the drama. He's in Sopot, which is on the Baltic Sea. It's a little resort outside of Gdansk. It's now been absorbed into that Gdansk-Gdynia complex. He's in Sopot. And so Hitler then gives the order that they should withdraw. But as they're withdrawing, the Wehrmacht continues to fire, and there are further casualties. So this area, by the way, that was on Stalin's side, and that he's retaken by force with casualties, these are the Drohobych oil fields. And so is it a coincidence in Stalin's mind that the Germans would take those old oil fields
Brilliant double wood.
on his side of the line, or was it something they did on purpose?
Of course,
Anyway, so this is
course
the way
that
we understand
happens.
this pact, with
Got greedy with the boards,
the actual
but
nature of the regimes and the mentality.
why
Now, you can
not?
argue that we don't know for sure on some of these questions, and I would
I
agree with
barely
you.
the horde.
Some of these questions we don't have full documentation.
Unnecessary.
But nonetheless, we have pretty good documentation on most of the stuff that I'm outlining for you. So let me conclude. All right. I'm just about there. I think I have 1 minute left of time, or 2 minutes left of time. So, what has this meant? What have I been trying to say? What's my point, if any? We have to do a version of history which takes into account these larger structures. Right? For example, German power, Russian power, British power.
That's such an important
The nature of
move.
that power, the institutions of that power, the ideas that drive that, right? And then we have certain actors who, by various circumstances, come to power and are decision makers within big things like German power or Russian power or British power. And so that's kind of my argument of how history works. History is this big structural landscape, a gigantic structural landscape, which is determined by very big structures. And as I said, everything from state-to-state relations to global commodity prices to the productivity of your peasantry to you name it, you fill in the blank. And within that structural landscape, historical actors, right, perceive or fail to perceive opportunities. They see or don't see places that they can seize, opportunities that they can seize to try to affect that structural landscape. Most of those opportunities are not created by them. They're created by accident, circumstance, contingencies, things that they don't foresee. And so historical agency is about opportunities that you don't create, that you don't foresee, but that you perceive in real time and you try to bend to your will. And if you succeed in seizing such an opportunity, if you manage to do something like that, you can alter the structural landscape for others. Because the structural landscape is a system, and it has system effects, including unintended consequences. You know, knock this, and something falls over there, even though you knocked it this way, because they're interrelated. They're connected in some systemic fashion. So sometimes the actors don't understand this, and they miscalculate. They misperceive. They fail to see the opportunities, or they see opportunities that they're delusions. They delude themselves. Sometimes they overestimate their power. They overestimate their legitimacy. They overestimate the nature of their society, whatever it might be. So this process of connection between these big forces, or the structures, and then this individual agency, right? This is the challenge of all the history that we write. And some of the agents can be people who make decisions about global commodity prices, right? They can sit there in London at a commodities market and make a big bet, and it can affect the lives of coffee growers all throughout South America who have no idea who this person in London is. They've never met this person. They never will meet this person. But this person has tremendous influence on the lives of these people. Similarly, the coffee growers themselves can adopt or fail to adopt certain ways of growing the coffee, which can have tremendous consequences for the size of the crop that particular year, or for even the nature of the crop itself. Right? Anyway, so this challenge, which I feel, heavy burden, of connecting the structures and the individual agency. When you write a biography of somebody, normally you just assume they can do what they want, and that they're the cause or the motivator behind everything. Right? You see this with Churchill biographies, you see this with George Washington or Abraham Lincoln biographies. Right? They're in every sentence, they're in every page, they're the subject of every sentence, they're the main actor. Whatever they do, it then happens. Right? This is a conceit of biography. And then you see kind of foreign policy history, which is all the big structural forces that are too big for any one individual, and there are no people. It's devoid of people, right? And you can't see how the individuals interact with that. And so this is maybe banal, but then again, that wouldn't be the first time. But this challenge of relating the structural forces to the agency can be done in these episodes. And in these episodes, you can see that people, whether they perceive or misperceive these opportunities, whether they seize them, whether they turn them to advantage, whether in fact if there's short-term gain and long-term miscalculation, and then how this ripples, how the consequences of power and decision-making ripples through the system, and then how the system ripples back onto the decision-maker for the next series of mistakes or miscalculations or seizure of opportunities. Anyway, thank you for your attention.
Most people have only ever written an essay if it was demanded of them in school in order to get a grade. You're missing.
Right. So I'm making myself dumber? Mm-hmm. Associate format and deadline to work out. I break down structured argument, verbal fluency, writing versus speaking, crystallized intelligence. How do I write?
Writing essays. First and foremost, this skill that writing essays, personal essays in your own time, really trains is something known as structured argumentation. And this is a skill that not many people have. You'll be familiar with this, right? Because you will know some super intelligent individuals, some people who perform so well on tests and in exams, and yet when you sort of corner them and ask for their opinion on something, they are unable to give you an opinion. They're unable to reason through their own logic, and that's because they don't know how to do structured argumentation. It is a highly complex skill, and like any complex skill, you only train and develop.
I'm not gonna lie, I kind of agree with this. I do kind of agree with it. If you can't formulate, because I wonder when I actually was able to formulate my opinions. I kind of been always.
retain it if you are constantly performing that skill, if you are constantly utilizing structured argumentation, if you're constantly writing essays. It also trains your verbal fluency, and I think this is something that's going to become increasingly more important because a lot of people are outsourcing the writing and the editing of material to AI, which is one of its use cases. But the problem with this is that people are converging upon very, very similar sounding tones, phrases, and structures. And what this means is that our global verbal fluency is decreasing. People's ability, what that means, basically verbal fluency, is the ability of you to quickly deploy language. So to choose what word fits best in a specific content and to use it. So right now I'm performing verbal fluency. I don't have a script, I have a couple of bullet points, and what I'm saying to you is largely improvised based upon what I know I want to say in this video. In order for me to be talking to you, my brain has got to be predicting, okay, what word is coming next, what phrase is coming next. And people's ability to do this is what is decreasing because of a lack of engagement with their own thinking processes. Now, writing is so much better than speaking for this. Speaking, you use colloquial terms, you can gloss over some things. Writing is much more structured and considered, and it often requires you to use more sophisticated ideas to put across your perspectives than when you are talking.
That's my favorite notes, but I might just only use that.
In aggregate, as well as developing your own unique use of vocabulary, your own unique perspective on how words should and shouldn't be used and what they mean. There's also actually a lot of evidential backing that regular writing practice increases what is known as crystallized intelligence, and this is essentially your accumulated verbal and reasoning ability. And this is the kind of thing that compounds over time, and writing is one of the most direct ways of building this crystallized intelligence. So it's 5 minutes a day that you can be spending writing a little essay for yourself that rewards you really significantly in your brain's cognitive capacity to perform. So how do you actually write an essay? Well, you start with a topic. If you're sat there thinking, I have no idea what to write about, you're lacking in imagination, and that is another problem that a lot of people face. There are so many things to write about. I am currently sat in my university room. I'm at university. I could write about my thoughts on the education system. I could write about my thoughts on how AI is going to be disrupting the university process. I could write about my perspective of moving from home, moving to university. I could look around me. There are these beautiful wooden beams. I could write about the decline of use of wooden architecture, whether I personally like or dislike that. I could talk about how I particularly like patterned cushion covers over plain ones. You can talk about anything. I can talk about how much I hate yellow as a choice for wall paint. It can be trivial or non-trivial.
I feel cooled out because I used to do one of my houses. I did do that. Kill yourself. Add on him. Kill yourself. Those are the most NPC topics. If you can't call yourself imaginative and then just say those things, I'll be going for fast travel. I should be meaning to write. And probably how language is used in video games. Because I'm sorry, the graphical fidelity, meaning the verisimilitude of a world. That's not even really. I haven't even really misusing the word verisimilitude, but that just fits closer to what they're talking about. What they're talking about is so bullshit. It's not what that means. It should be like concerning hitboxes aligning with the actual model of the thing. It's like Dark Souls 2 does not have visual fidelity. Oh my word, I really don't like how pretentious people that wanted to justify doing really shitty game reviews. They need to justify their existence. What they did was basically use pretentious words. No one uses fidelity apart from like, who uses the word fidelity and like when next you can use the veracity of something or the verisimilitude. I guess that kind of means truth too. Why are you being so pretentious? Yeah, English language is being completely fucking ruined by Latin terms too. Like in medias res. Oh well, this story employs in medias res. Fuck off. Seriously, fuck off. Advanced Japanese is so easy because it's just like, oh, I know what that Chinese character means. It means like fast forward and then story. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So that makes it. It's like words like 89,000, and it's like, oh, I know that. I can actually figure out what the fuck it means. I don't have to know Latin and blah blah blah. I mean, it's cool, but it's not fun to engage in a language that's written that has words because of like an elite system back in the day, because of elite fucking cunts back in the day. They're going, oh, well, I have Latin education, so I'm actually gonna sully the language of a bunch of terms, and so now all the medical field is filled with terms that nobody fucking knows intuitively. Not good, no bueno. That's so obviously no bueno in, you know, actually people understanding, you know, advanced language. And so clearly a fucking hurdle.
It doesn't matter. You're going to pick a topic to write about. If you cannot do that, you have some deeper problems in terms of your imaginative capacity, and you should be sitting down and trying to address that. Once you've got a title, you're going to want to writing.
Jesus.
Going to want to writing. That doesn't make sense. Going to want to be writing about 300 to 800 words, somewhere there. It doesn't have to be an extortionate amount. Give yourself 2 pages in my journal, a page of A4, 2 lines, whatever it is. You're going to give yourself some sort of minimum. And what I will say to you is just write. Don't plan necessarily. If you want a really beautiful structured essay, obviously make a plan. But I think one of the big benefits of not planning is you just really see how your brain works. And sometimes what this means is I write for 10 minutes, and all of a sudden I have a revelation, and I'm thinking, oh, I actually don't agree with what I've just written. I don't cross it out, but I just move on. I pick up the counter argument, I explore it, I develop it, and then I say, well, in conclusion, actually, I think I've revised my own opinion. It's really powerful to write through your own perspectives and ideas, and you will see that you change your mind a lot more than you might think. Once a week is by far more than enough to see some of these cognitive benefits. Obviously, the effects compound over time, and the more frequently you are doing this, the more frequently you will get these compounding effects. But I don't think it's worth you saying, I'm going to do this twice a day, I'm going to do this every single day. If you know that that's feasible, you want to pick a goal of frequency that is attainable for you, and that is going to allow you to be motivated by doing this. And what I highly recommend you do is you take a specific notebook and you write all of your essays in one book, such that then you can go back and you can read, and you can see, oh, I've really changed and improved my writing style. I've really improved my ability to speak persuasive. I think my thoughts are a lot more eloquent and a lot clearer. You're not going to be able to recognize that over 2 or 3 months, but the more you do it, the more you practice the skill, the more you are going to see those benefits. So you probably resented writing essays in school. I'm going to make you fall in love with writing essays, and that process is going to start with you finishing this video, getting a notebook, picking up a pen, and writing your first essay. Let me know in the comments what the topic of your essay is, and my email is in the description. You can send it over to me. I would love to read your essay.
What the fuck? Fuck, no, I'm not sending you my essays about fast travel. She's not gonna see that. And I'm not writing an essay. Alright.
Today we have Slack, Discord, group chats, servers, emojis, bots, all the things we expect from modern online communities. But before all of that, there was IRC. Internet Relay Chat was one of the earliest real-time communication systems on the internet. And if you were online in the 90s, there's a good chance you spent way too many hours using it. It was chaotic, nerdy, sometimes mysterious, and occasionally a little bit illegal. It's where hackers hung out, open source projects were coordinated, gaming clans formed, and where a lot of early internet culture was born. In many ways, IRC was the Wild West of online chat. And today, we're going to take a look at how it worked, the software people used, and why it became such a huge part of early internet life. IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat, and it was created in 1988 by a Finnish computer scientist. His original goal was pretty simple. He wanted to replace the old bulletin board chat system at the University of Oulu with something that could operate across the growing internet. The solution he built was surprisingly elegant. Instead of a single central server, IRC used networks of servers that linked together. When you connected to one server, you effectively became part of the entire network. From there, you could join different chat rooms, known as channels, and instantly talk to people from all over the world. And in the late 80s and early 90s, real-time communication with strangers across the continents felt almost magical. IRC didn't have flashy graphics or modern interfaces. There were no avatars, emojis, or reaction buttons. Just text. But despite its simplicity, it was incredibly powerful. Chat rooms were called channels, and they were usually named with a hashtag in front, like hashtag Linux, hashtag Quake, or hashtag programming. To join one, you would simply type the command like /join hashtag Linux. If you wanted to send someone a private message, you could type /msg for message, and then a username. And if you were a channel operator, you had additional powers. You could kick someone out of the channel, or ban them entirely. Using IRC often felt a little like operating a command terminal from a hacker movie, and for a lot of people, it was the first time they felt like they were really controlling a computer, instead of just clicking on one. People didn't connect to IRC through a web browser. Instead, they used dedicated software known as an IRC client. One of the most famous was IRC, which became extremely popular on Windows during the 90s. IRC had a graphical interface, scripting support, file transfers, and automation features. It was powerful, but also relatively easy to use, which made it incredibly popular with everyday internet users. Then, there was BitchX. Yes, that was the real name. BitchX was a Unix and Linux IRC client based on an earlier client called IRC2, and it lived entirely inside a terminal window. It looked intimidating at first, but it was extremely powerful and highly customizable. If IRC was the friendly Windows client, BitchX was the choice for sysadmins, Linux users, and hardcore terminal enthusiasts. There were also many other clients like IRSSI, as in IRC, XChat, Epic, and IRC2, each with their own loyal communities. And if you really wanted to stand out, you could customize your client with scripts, themes, and automation that turned IRC into a surprisingly sophisticated tool. In the early days of the internet, IRC wasn't just a chat platform. It was where entire communities gathered. Open source developers coordinated projects there. Linux users helped each other troubleshoot problems. Gaming clans recruited members and organized matches. Even technical support often happened on IRC. Instead of searching forums for documentation, you could join a channel like Linux Help, ask your question, and often get an answer from someone within minutes. It wasn't always organized, and sometimes it was chaotic, but it worked surprisingly well. In many ways, IRC functioned as a kind of proto-Discord, decades before modern platforms existed. Of course, we can't talk about IRC history without mentioning one of its most infamous communities, the Wares scene. Wares was slang for pirated software, games, applications, movies, music, and all kinds of digital media, if you know what I mean, were shared through underground communities that operated largely through IRC. Groups competed to crack copy protections and release software first. These releases were distributed through private channels and invite-only communities. It became a highly organized underground ecosystem with its own rules, reputation systems, and hierarchies. For better or worse, IRC became one of the central hubs of this scene. One of the most fascinating features of IRC was something called fserv, short for file server. With the right scripts or client configuration, a user could share files directly from their computer through their IRC client. Other users could browse the available files and request downloads using simple commands. You might see commands like !list, !slots, !get filename.zip. Bots and scripts manage queues and download slots.
Exclamation mark times.
Quite a while before your turn came up. When the transfer finally started, it used something called DCC, or direct client connection. That meant the file wasn't coming from a central server. It was being transferred directly from another person's computer. In other words, IRC was doing peer-to-peer file sharing long before services like Napster or LimeWire became mainstream. IRC also had its own unique brand of chaos. One of the strangest phenomena was something called a net split. Because IRC networks were made up of multiple interconnected servers, sometimes the connection between two parts of the network would fail. When that happened, the users connected to those servers would suddenly appear to disappear from the channel. Then, once the servers reconnected, all of the users would reappear at once. It often looked like half the channel had simply vanished, and then magically returned a few minutes later. Combined with channel takeovers, bot wars, script battles, and constant operator drama, IRC could sometimes feel like a digital frontier town. Messy, unpredictable, but incredibly fun. Even though platforms like Discord and Slack have largely taken over today, IRC hasn't completely disappeared. Many networks are still active, including OFTC and EFNet, and they continue to host communities around the world. Many open source projects still rely on IRC as a lightweight and reliable communication tool. But more importantly, IRC helped shape the culture of the early internet. It was where developers collaborated, gamers gathered, friendships formed, and entire subcultures emerged. For many people, it was their first experience with a truly global online community. And looking back, it's hard not to feel a little nostalgic for a time when the internet felt smaller, stranger, and a little more adventurous. Special shout out to all my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see exclusive Silicon Siren content, be sure to visit me on Patreon. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, that's what Jim Simon's telling. When we look at of education, you're not only a mathematician and father and everything else that you do, but you're a teacher and you're an educator. Talk to me about your vision for the future. What's your philosophy of teaching?
Yeah, so it needs to evolve quite a bit for many reasons. Yeah, so the world has become infinitely more complex and unstable and unpredictable. And now, and now with AI, humans used to sort of have a monopoly on cognitive tasks like, and now AI. So one of the problems with AI, actually, I mean, the way the subject develops, it's not so much that it will overtake human, like research level mathematics or any other discipline in the near future, but already undergraduate level mathematics, for instance, many of the homework assignments that we assign right now, they can be done by AI.
Yeah.
So we have to reinvent the way we teach. So one thing that will become more important is students will need to have much more training in how to validate information that they see. So in the past we had like a small number of authoritative source of information, textbooks and your teacher or something, and we didn't have social media and the internet and all kinds of information of now AI. All the information was really variable quality. On the other hand, in the past when you had information that was low quality in content, it was also low quality in presentation. So you could tell that like, a really well produced textbook would likely have more accurate content than something written in crayon or something. But now our ability to produce high quality presentation has far outpaced our ability to produce high quality content. So you can have YouTube videos or textbooks that look flawless and now AI generated output, but have got lots of fundamental mistakes. So we need to encourage critical thinking. I already see teachers experimenting with things like, here's a question that I would have assigned, but I've given it to ChatGPT, and this is the answer that I give. It's wrong. Please critique it and correct it.
Interesting.
And these are, I think, more of the skills, more interactive. So not treating knowledge as a passive thing to be acquired by an authority, but something that you always have to question
and struggle with. Interesting. That kind of reminds me of John Preskill at Caltech, talking about quantum computing and quantum supremacy and stuff like. And one of the ways to overcome some of the issues with error correction in quantum computing is just throw more qubits at the problem. And I wonder, will we throw more AIs at the problem? This kind of flipped it. You threw natural, human brains at an AI to prove what's wrong. But will we be at a place where AI could police itself? And if so, what would it take to trust them?
It's good to make them more reliable, but I think, well, maybe if we use a very different architecture from the current AIs, so by nature they are inherently unreliable. But we have ways to use unreliable tools. Random number generators are the most unreliable device technology we have, but extremely useful for kinds of things like cryptography.
Yeah.
I think as long as you pair these AIs with good verification, and you only use the AIs to the extent that you can verify the outputs and no further, then they can be a great tool. I see them more as complementing human scientists and mathematicians. Because there are so few human scientists in the world, and we only have so much time to work on research, we tend to focus on sort of high value, high priority, isolated problems. But in mathematics and the sciences, there are millions and millions. There's a long tail.
Oh my
lots and lots of less well-known problems, which should require some attention, but and they're not the most difficult or important. But it'll be good to have someone or something look at them. And so I think
I hate round 14. I really do hate it.
To target them on the most high-profile problems, but actually on the millions of medium difficulty problems. And they may fail, and they may only solve 10% of these million problems. But that's 100,000 problems solved. So scale is their big advantage. You cannot scale a graduate student this way. Okay,
but not legally.
No, not legally. Or ethically. Okay, but AI, I think that's where the real value lies.
What's your highest priority task right now?
Well, research-wise, what I'm interested in most nowadays is new workflows to modernize mathematics and make it more more collaborative, more accessible to the public, and to integrate in these new tools like AI. The way that we've done mathematics has not changed fundamentally in centuries. We even see our blackboards in my office. We still work with pen and paper. We use computers a little bit. But not so much. And our collaborations are still very small. We work with 2 or 3 people. In the sciences, of course, thousands. In large part because we don't know how to incorporate contributions to the general public. There's a barrier to entry, first of all. A lot of what we do is very technical. But we need to synthesize proofs where every single step has to be verified. So if we had thousands of people, you have to verify 1,000 little components. It wasn't feasible until very recently. Also, because of all these factors, we don't collaborate as much with the other sciences as we ought to. Especially the new sciences, which are so data-driven and connect the real world in new ways. Like social network analysis or whatever. So that is, I think, the direction which my research is going to. It's almost more the sociology of mathematics actually than the technique. And more recently, I've been interested in trying to secure funding for mathematical research, since that has become very unstable in recent years.
We'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah. So, mutual friend Sergio Kleinerman asked me a question related to what you just brought up, sociology of science, and he wondered how it was stressful for you to be, reputed the best mathematician on earth, a Fields medalist, a very young and extremely successful mathematician. Did that affect you? Was that a challenge for you with that mantle, that weight on your shoulders, perhaps, or maybe not?
Okay, I do remember the year about 2006. My life did change in many ways. So suddenly I got invitations like embassies, and I would meet with people who I would not normally meet, and I got asked to be on all these committees.
Oh my goodness!
So that was a sea change.
I didn't click F.
I was on some of these already, but so that took some getting used to. But I think one thing that helps ground.
I didn't click F.
As a pure mathematician, your main task is you have problems you want to solve, and you want to prove theorems that solve these problems, and your proof has to be correct. Every step has to be validated. And it doesn't matter how famous you are or how much of a reputation you have. You can't just say, I've proven something, trust me. Okay, you have to supply the details, you have to supply the proofs. And if you don't have the proof, you don't have the proof. So I think this naturally provides some check on this, how high ego can go just from his awards. Because, there are countless problems that I would love to solve. The Trim project we talked about, but hundreds of problems that I'd love to solve. I just know I don't know how to solve. And so I know more problems that I can't solve than the problems I have solved. So I think that so that keeps you somewhat honest.
What about the old trope that mathematicians do their best work by age 30? We're in our 50s now, you and I. What do you make of that statement? Jim Simons used to tell me he didn't really believe it. He thought that actually a clock starts, at a certain moment, and then you have 10 years or 20 years to do. And he did stop at age 30, but that's because he worked at Pensley for 10 years, not because he hit an arbitrary age. Right. You've heard this trope. What do you make of it?
Yeah. So different mathematicians have different career tracks. So I definitely was stereotypical because I had a good child. I accelerated. I skipped several grades. And so, yeah, I did a lot of my work when I was younger. But there are other mathematicians who started quite late. They didn't become interested in mathematics until college. When they switched, became quite good. My advisor, when I was in Princeton, my PhD advisor, Eli Stein, I would meet with him every week, and I would discuss the problems that he'd assigned me to work on. And I'd spend hours trying all kinds of crazy things, and I'd report all these things I tried didn't work. I tried this to do work. I had all this energy and time. And he would just sort of look at what I wrote on Blackboard and just think for a few seconds and say, the difficulty you're having is exactly the same difficulty that so-and-so had in this paper. So if you go filing cabinet and you push out this one paper, a preprint, to read this will solve your problem. So there was a different way of doing mathematics. I couldn't see how he put, because I would go home and read it and it would solve my problem. I would then hit another structure the next week. But no, I spent hours on these problems. And he just thought about it for 10 seconds. And he just knew from experience what to do. It's the wisdom. Just wisdom. Yeah, wisdom. So I think as you get older, you approach, you find different ways to do mathematics, which it may not be as flashy, in terms of brute force, it may not be as fast, but it can be more productive. Yeah, I can now pull the same trick off my own graduate students, and so it's kind of satisfying to see full circle there. Okay.
If you do second order, you can say what my advisor told me, Rudy.
Yeah, I knew that zombie was gonna hit me.
Good evening and welcome to the Cato Institute in the era of both right.
Use absolute GDP. How do you of and for that wonderful introduction. I'm sorry you didn't keep going. It was so good. I would really like to be able to live up to that introduction. It's very nice to be, this is my first time in this building. It's very nice to be in a group that understands and values and defends liberty. As you know, there are many enemies of liberty, and even worse, there are people willing to give it away. So it's nice to keep remembering the fight that produced it and that is necessary to keep it. So that's going to be one of the principal themes of my lecture. So, I took this picture myself. That's President Vladimir Putin riding the American Eagle, which is pretty much our understanding of Russia today here in the United States. This is another important picture. You'll recognize the great sportsman Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union for 18 years during the sort of late Soviet period. And so these are our images of Russia, or this passes for a debate about Russia today in the US. This image, which is the predominant one about Russia now, and this image, which is sort of our understanding of that Soviet phenomenon about how it decayed, it degraded, it got flabby, it wasn't really a big threat anymore, and so somehow now it's a really big threat, but towards the end the Soviet Union wasn't a big threat. Well, as you know, Leonid Brezhnev had 1/3 the size of the US economy at peak, and this guy has about 1/13, depending how you measure. It's not easy to measure. Do you use purchasing power parity? Do you use absolute GDP? How do you measure Soviet economy? They didn't have real prices. These are approximations. But nonetheless, about 1/13 and about 1/3 American economy. Double the population that this guy has, 40,000 nuclear weapons, 40,000 tons of chemical weapons, and of course the biological weapons program that the CIA didn't really know about fully until after the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Soviet Union was a massively armed state, 5.3 million men under arm, 600,000 troops in Eastern Europe, 400,000 troops in East Germany alone. And so we wouldn't want to mistake the size of the threat that each of these posed in their day.
Are you serious?
This is the rest of the policy debate that we have currently in the US. First, that there's this Russian president riding the American Eagle. Then there was this flabby, degrading, declining Soviet Union. Certainly nothing compared to the current Russian offensive. And then there's this bizarre admiration that's going on that we seem to need an investigation of to get to the bottom of when it's right there in front of our face. So sadly, this is what I understand to be the current policy debate in the US about Russia. I get many invitations to talk about policy, and those 3 slides with the assumptions built into them account for the majority of the questions that I usually get from the audiences. And these are people who pay close attention to foreign affairs. Okay. So I don't think that this is correct. Okay. Now, we're now at the point in the lecture where I'm supposed to pivot. And I'm supposed to tell you that there's this really deep problem, threat to freedom, Soviet Union, Russia, and connect Stalin to Putin. Because that's the only way you can talk about a Stalin book to an educated audience is to connect it to the current affairs. And also, you're looking to get that booking on MSNBC. And they're not going to book you on MSNBC, otherwise known as Red Army TV. Unless, of course, you can connect the history to the present somehow. So as I say, this would be the point in the lecture where I would pivot. Am I supposed to stand up here? I'm sorry, I left the cage. Did I frighten anybody? It's one of those things that'll be on the news later that the animal escaped from the zoo and they needed the tranquilizer gun. I'm not very good at giving lectures. I never really figured this out. So I pace. This guy also paced, as you know. He paced because his bones hurt, his joints hurt. He had all sorts of arthritic and other ailments. I pace because I'm trying to figure out what to say. Okay. So this is where I'm supposed to pivot now and connect Stalin to Putin, the Soviet Union to Russia in a more serious way based upon history. The problem is that Stalin and Lenin together killed 18 to 20 million people. Most of it was Stalin. And so the idea that there's something close between these two regimes, you have to be very careful, because the scale of the horrors is just off the charts under communism, as David referred to in his introduction. And as bad as the current regime is, and let's be honest, the current regime in Russia is a gangster regime, as bad as it is, it's just not comparable to this kind of stuff. Stalin was the master of the smear, but he controlled the public sphere fully. And so you couldn't defend yourself against the smear. Putin's regime is good at the smear, but is not really on the same level. So what are we going to do instead? Right? You can see the slyness in both of the pictures. Let's also talk a little bit now as a preface about the information wars and Russia's interference in our democracy, just by way of background. So in the 1990s, there was a very big Russian money laundering scandal. And a lot of money, which was stolen inside Russia, was laundered outside. And we got all worked up about this Russian money laundering scandal. Well, was it a Russian money laundering scandal? It was actually the Bank of New York that laundered the money. Now, the Bank of New York denied that they were involved in these operations. They've never admitted guilt. To the extent that they were brought to court, they paid only court fees rather than a significant settlement. But my proposition to you is that the Russian money laundering was the Western financial system laundering Russian money. And so imagine that Vladimir Putin was sitting around working in the FSB, and he had a great idea. He decided to find a kid at Harvard in a dorm room, make the kid not finish Harvard, but instead start a business, have this business grow and connect the whole world together, and then use this person, use this instrument, use this business, which later would become world famous as Facebook, in order to overturn democracies in the world. And it was a brilliant idea that he had to take this kid at Harvard and to build up this system, and it worked. My point is simply that the Russian information wars are, again, an American problem. Just like the Bank of New York accusations, charges of money laundering of Russian money, the Russians stole the money, and the Bank of New York was accused of laundering it, but without the Western financial system, the Russians really couldn't have done anything. So without the ecosystem that we have created, and we are the issue, it's our technology. So the Putin information wars are not really Putin information wars, they're American information wars, and we have to solve this problem. His nasty behavior has further indicated to us that we have a problem. So, have you been to the Russian high-tech industry? I've been there. It's in Tel Aviv. And the reason it's in Tel Aviv is because the Russians don't have a civilian high-tech industry. They do nothing but hemorrhage intellectual capital. Their intellectual capital is everywhere but Russia. It's sitting right here in this room. And their high-tech industry is in Israel. So once again, is it Putin's information wars? He doesn't have a civilian high-tech industry. He's got some military high-tech, but nothing compared to what the United States has and that he's using. So in understanding the Russian phenomenon and the challenges that it presents, a lot of it has to do with our institutions, our technology, our behavior, our governance, our lack of governance, etc. So, okay. Now, if you want to talk about the specifics of what's going on in Russia, it's very depressing. Right, here they are, taking over the world on cable television. By the way, have you noticed that the Democrats have their Cold War, which is with Russia, but the Republicans have their own Cold War, which is with China? And that each side prefers its own Cold War, so the Democrats prefer to talk about the Russia threat, and now the Republicans prefer to talk about the Chinese threat. Back in the actual Cold War, they shared. There was one Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they each had a piece of it. Now they've got their own. So the Russian threat, which seems to loom very large, is not as big on the Republican side as now the Chinese threat has become. Okay. So if you think about what's going on in Russia, the degradation of the human capital, the continued lack of diversity of the economy, the demographic situation, all the things that you and other experts know about, right? There's no long-term pattern of modernization, of investing in social capital and people, of building infrastructure, of gaining the kinds of necessary structural attributes that sustain power over the long term. There's tremendous spoliation, and there's asymmetric taking advantage of those things that we do wrong or don't or should do better. But there is no aggrandizement of Russian power over the long term. Russia's grand strategy is hang on, cause trouble, and when the West collapses, we'll be okay. In other words, relative to the West, Russia's terrible. So if the West collapses, Russia's okay. China at this point will also have to collapse for them, which is something they didn't plan on 15 or 20 years ago. So we need to be clearer about the nature of the Russian threat, because as you know, the bigger threats get, the bigger certain things around threats also get. So as to repeat, it's a gangster regime, but it is not an existential threat, and it can be dealt with in a way that doesn't require 24/7 attention or massive investments in the kinds of things that we did during the Cold War. Okay. So this is, if you've been to the White House recently, that's the White House now. And you can see it's been rebranded at the top. It says Trump now. So we focus quite a bit, obviously, on the Circus Act that we have here in town. And there's something to that. Obviously, it's the business model for the media now on both sides to have the Trump. It's also, as Oslo and I were talking before, it's our business model, because the more chaos or seeming chaos or apparent chaos, the more we get invited to give lectures about the chaos. But this is another thing the lecture is not going to be about right now. Let me just see if we're done yet. So I'm getting to the lecture itself. I know you've been waiting patiently, and I know this hasn't been very good, but the lecture is now coming. So there's a roundabout way of saying that we need to reorient our thinking a little bit, because we're kind of caught up in a certain day-to-day entertainment, infotainment complex, etc. Okay. So what do I see as the main things that we should understand? What should this lecture be about? That's where we are now. I know I'm not allowed off the stage, And I don't have to go off the stage now because usually I go off the stage in order to check on the sales of the J. Crew sweatpants and the Facebook updating, the updating of the profiles on Facebook and the other things that happen during my lectures. But I see no laptops open right now during this lecture, so there's actually no reason for me to leave the stage. You think I'm kidding? You think anything I've said has been in jest? It's all been serious. So this is the thing. We have a new version of authoritarianism, and that's the thing to understand. And it goes something like this. There are 4 attributes to modern authoritarianism. The definition of modern authoritarianism is the rule of the few in the name of the many. In the old days, we had the rule of the few in the name of the few. That was aristocratic rule or various other versions. Now we have the rule of the few in the name of the many. That's modern authoritarianism. And the key thing about modern authoritarianism is the absence of serious limits on executive power. So there are 4 attributes to this. One is you have to have a big repressive apparatus. You got to be able to repress. Physically repress, information repress, a big repressive apparatus. You can't have too efficient a repressive apparatus because then you could get in trouble because they could repress you. So you need a big repressive apparatus for your domestic population, but it has to be subdivided into many different competing rival organizations, and it has to be ipso facto inefficient. If it's too efficient, right, you end up being on the receiving end of the efficiency of the repressive apparatus as the ruling group or the ruler. So we see you need this. This is a precondition, repressive apparatus. You give me a repressive apparatus, I can get a lot of things done. The problem is that it's not enough. You need a second piece. I'm going to give you 4. And the second piece is this. The second piece is cash flow. Cash flow is really critical for an authoritarian regime. Why? We have this silly understanding, now it's true, it's only in academia, that authoritarian regimes go into a bargain, a social bargain with their population. They promise to grow the economy, and the population relinquishes its liberties or its freedoms for the time being as the economy grows. Right? There's no such bargain. Because if the regime fails to grow the economy, the regime doesn't say, I'm sorry, we didn't keep our half of the bargain, and therefore, we're going to leave power now. We stopped growing the economy, and we had this deal where you gave up your civil liberties and we were in power while we were growing it, but we failed to grow it, so we're sorry, we're leaving now. No, they just repress. They don't leave power. However, they don't need to grow the economy. What they need is cash flow. They need liquidity. The easiest way to get cash flow is when you just pick it up from under the ground. Right? You extract hydrocarbons, you extract diamonds or silver or all sorts of other things, or you hack it. You go into somebody's central bank and you transfer money from their account to your account. Or you counterfeit $100 bills en masse, or whatever it might be. Cash flow is absolutely critical to an authoritarian regime. It's also the most significant point of vulnerability. What human rights was in the 70s, 80s, in battling authoritarianism, anti-corruption and going for the jugular on cash flow should be where policy is today. It's fine to fight for human rights and to campaign for human rights. It's not as effective as it once was. However, anti-corruption, choking the cash flow off, taking them out of the international banking system, closing down the offshoring, all of those things get them at the jugular. They cannot function. Putin's regime does not bank in North Korea. They bank in Frankfurt, they bank in Vienna, they bank in Liechtenstein, they bank in London, they bank in New York. Those are the places where these regimes are vulnerable, as we saw with the North Korean case and the Iranian case, very good sanctions that came out of the Treasury Department. So they need that cash flow, that's the second attribute. The third attribute is control over life chances. Control over life chances sounds easy, but for example, if you can open a business by yourself, well then, you don't have to pay obeisance to the regime. If there's a big private sector, if you're not dependent on the state for employment, or for your kids to go to school, or for yourself to get housing, or for yourself to go on holiday, or whatever it might be, if you're not dependent on the state, if they don't control your life chances, you have a lot more space in a regime like that. So the more there's state control over the economy, state control over education, state control over housing, right, the more empowered these regimes are. It's textbook. So their ability to control life chances often takes place in denial of access, right? Kick you out of school, kick you out of your job. And so when you see numbers for state employment, 50% of the economy is state employment, 80% of the economy, you know, and when you see that there aren't as many private universities or private elementary schools, right, control over life chances. This is critical to authoritarian regimes. Those regimes that don't control life chances are at risk all the time. You see with the Communist Party in China right now. It's doing this difficult dance with the private sector. Right? It encouraged the private sector because it needed the wealth, but now it's afraid of the private sector because what is the private sector? It's freedom. It's people's ability to establish businesses, school their children, go on holiday, to live with nobody controlling their life chances. Right? And so you think the Communist Party is now going to do a major liberalization in China and open up or reduce its control over life chances? Obviously, it's going in the other direction, right? Because there's a major threat to the regime from the power that people accumulate in a private sector. Okay. And the fourth piece is what I call the well or the ideological piece. That's where you have to invent stories, you have to invent powerful narratives that speak to people and speak to their fears and speak to their dependence on you. So the control over life chances gives you a lot. The cash flow is fundamental. The repressive apparatus, you can't do without it. But when push comes to shove, it's the narratives, right? The ability to talk about internal enemies and external enemies. Oh, you know, you got a big package here. They could be the ethnicity that's a minority. They could be Roma or Gypsies. They could be Jews. They could be Serbs versus Croats. They could be immigrants. They could be anything, right? So this well, right, you put the bucket down the well and you bring up the stories about the great past that you once had, that they're trying to take away from you. They're trying to prevent you from reclaiming this great past. Who? Well, your external enemies, but they're internal enemies, like a fifth column. And who are they? And you go through, and this ability to tell stories, persuasive stories, is very impressive. Some of these authoritarian regimes are amazing. They're absolutely stunning in their ability to manufacture these stories, which are about fear, insecurity, reclaiming a great past, the prevention of unequal treaties, humiliation by the outside powers, right? It's one after another. They're about grievance, and they're about hopes and dreams that are blocked, but some leader or some group is going to realize these things. So if you put these four pieces together, that's modern authoritarianism. There's a lot of overlap with totalitarianism. Yes, they did all of these things too, but the scale is very different. You see, violence is very costly, so you don't have to have a lot of violence. It's kind of like an accordion. Stalin, like this. Putin, more like this, more selective in the application of the violence. You're violent, but you're not the gigantic violence that you had back then, right? And so this modern authoritarianism doesn't have to be as xenophobic like an accordion. You can open or close the xenophobia. You need more xenophobia, you open up the sluices a little bit. You get by without it because it's potentially destabilizing. Violence and xenophobia are potentially difficult to manage. So if you can get by without heavy violence and without xenophobia, it's a lot easier to rule. the last piece, I said there were 4 attributes. The last piece is the international system and whether it's conducive or corrosive of authoritarianism. This is not something that the authoritarians themselves control. When it's the repressive apparatus and the cash flow and the control over life chances and the stories that they're able to manufacture, they have a lot of control over that. But the international system they have less control over. Right? Meaning, right, where do they bank? Or is there somebody promoting democracy intelligently and vigorously that's threatening them? Right? Is the international system conducive or corrosive of these authoritarian regimes? Well, right now you see that factor, it ceased to work against them, and now they're turning it more and more to their advantage. So that was the big surprise, and that's the thing where the modern authoritarianism that we had is on the offensive, and we're surprised by it. But once again, to refer to the earlier part of the conversation, it's our instruments that are at their disposal that enable them to make the international order less corrosive and maybe even conducive to their rule. So we need to focus not only or even predominantly on their nastiness, but on our failings, our vulnerabilities, our institutions, the things that we can have under our control to make the international factor less conducive to them, and maybe even to undermine some of these attributes that they have that make their regimes sustainable, at least in the short run. Authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable. I see I'm not that bad with time. Authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable for all sorts of reasons. As I pointed out, they're inefficient by design, because if they get too good at what they do, they have an internal coup. So they make themselves inefficient. They make themselves less good at what they do on purpose. Another inherent instability in authoritarian regimes is the succession mechanism, right? Meaning they don't have legal succession mechanisms. They tend to have uncertainty built in. Is the ruler going to get sick? Is the ruler maybe going to die? Who's going to take over if the ruler gets sick or dies? Is our property going to be protected? Is our liberty going to be protected if there's a change? You get ambitious people who worry. Mubarak is 80 years old and has cancer, and his son Gamal is not taken seriously by the rest of the elite. So their property and maybe even their lives are at stake. So the elite is not going to stay with Mubarak all the way. There's an inherent instability in all authoritarian regimes. And when courageous people come out in the streets, maybe the internal elite will say, you know what, this is our opportunity to protect ourselves in the uncertainty of the absence of secure succession mechanisms. Okay. So they're inherently unstable. But however, when they collapse, they can often collapse into themselves again. Another version of the regime comes back from the instability. So we look at the Putin regime and we see, for example, protests in the streets. We see courageous people. And these people are definitely courageous. They're risking their lives, certainly risking their livelihoods, potentially their relatives and their children's livelihoods, often by taking these actions. Right? So we have to understand that courage. At the same time, the dynamic of instability, the threat from the Putin regime comes from within. It comes from other elites looking around and seeing either opportunity that they can rise up or grievance that they've been pushed aside, or the uncertainty of the succession mechanism, which puts everything at risk. So this doesn't mean that the Putin regime is collapsing, but it does mean that there's not only degradation in Russia, but inherent instability in that regime right now as we speak in this room. We're unable to take advantage of that instability because we don't really have a Russia policy, as we discussed at the beginning of the lecture. It would be better to have a Russia policy. So if it's okay, let me conclude with that, the idea of a Russia policy. Right? If you've accepted what I've said already, you don't like the facile analogy between the totalitarian Stalin and the current Putin. However, you also understand that Putin is a very significantly nasty regime and is not our friend and not out for our interest, and we have to do something about it. You also understand that that regime has certain capabilities, but a lot of those capabilities are ours. Remember I said the problem was there are a lot of people who are trying to overthrow liberty, they're enemies of liberty, and then there are other people who want to give it away, which is even worse. That's the bigger problem, a much bigger problem. Okay. So what about policy? Where do you go from this? Right? So I'm not making the argument that what I study tells you everything you need to know about the Putin regime, right? I'm not one of these idiot savants who knows something about fascism and therefore says that, Trump is fascism. Look what's happening. Look at the rhetoric. Because I know something about fascism. Yeah, Trump is fascism. You can see, for example, the Gleichschaltung has already taken place. The court system has been taken over by the Nazi Party. They've eliminated all other political parties. There is no more freedom of the press because they closed down all the media institutions. There are several million paramilitaries who march in uniform throughout the streets. Yeah, Trump is fascism. I get that argument, right? So we don't want to make that argument about Putin either. That Putin is communism, right? That Putin is Stalinism. That Putin is Stalin. We have to avoid that kind of simplicity. And that doesn't mean we're going to let this regime off the hook. Okay, so how about policy? So where do you start with Russia policy? You don't want to end up where Russia is the center of attention and you're spending all your time talking about it and inviting people to Cato to talk about Russia when you could have had a good lecture about something important, right? You want to have a Russia policy where Russia is not the center of your attention. Meaning, whatever you're doing with Russia, it can't be some gigantic mobilization 24/7. On the other hand, you can't have no Russia policy at all, which is what we currently have. So where's the needle to be thread here?
Oh my God! What is with round 14?
Things, and then we'll pull the plug and see if there are any questions.
I hate this.
Relief, whatever it might be.
And some rats just speed buff.
I'm sure you've had better, but I gotta tell you, I do better in the morning slot, the lunchtime slot. Like the 6 o'clock evening slot is really something. All right, and I'm not even allowed to get off the stage. It's the caged animal problem, right? The muskrat who escaped from the zoo. So, Versailles Treaty, 1919. Remember the Versailles Treaty? There's a critique of the Versailles Treaty, and it goes like this. The peace was punitive. They accused Germany alone of being responsible for the war. They made Germany pay these giant reparations. It was very unfair. This punitive peace contributed to instability and the rise of Hitler. The Versailles Treaty was wrong. There's another critique, which is less prominent, but also there, which has to do with, oh no, the treaty was fine. The Germans were really the problem. But the British didn't have the willpower to enforce the treaty. They failed to do their job and be the great power to enforce the Versailles Treaty. These are the basic, simple, but these are the basic arguments in the literature on the Versailles Treaty. No one's going to rehabilitate the Versailles Treaty. It's kind of like trying to rehabilitate Chamberlain, for example. Invite me back again, which won't happen, but if you did, I'll do that lecture. The rehabilitation of Chamberlain lecture. That's the hardest. That's like the most difficult dive at the Olympics. That's like the triple jackknife dive, the Chamberlain lecture. Okay, so both arguments are wrong about the Versailles Treaty. Why? Because the Versailles Treaty is a complete anomaly. It's the only time, 1919, it's the only time since Bismarck's unification of Germany when both German power and Russian power were simultaneously flat on their back. That hasn't happened, that didn't happen before, and it hasn't happened again. And so you could confidently predict that either one or both of these powers would come back at some point. Remember, the Versailles Treaty was against Germany without Russia. Russia was not invited to participate, and the treaty was imposed on Germany. But you couldn't have a treaty against Germany without Russia that would last, because it's an anomaly. In fact, in a single generation, both German power and Russian power came back. They were great powers again within a single generation, not one, but both. And so, lo and behold, the British spent the entire interwar period trying to revise the Versailles Treaty. That's right, before Hitler came to power in 1933, the British were convening international conferences to get Germany into the post-war order. Remember Genoa in 1922? In fact, they toyed with the idea of even bringing the communist Soviet Russia into the international order to stabilize the situation. It didn't work. We all know, and there was World War II. So fast forward to 1991. Here we have German power, in some ways better, because you get unification of Germany. But we have Russian power flat on its back. And then there's a settlement that's imposed. The settlement doesn't stop in 1991, it moves after 1991. And the Russians are absolutely powerless to do anything about this imposition of the settlement in 1991. But they don't like it. Boris Yeltsin is telling the Ukrainians and everybody else who will listen that Crimea is Russian territory. This is 1991. As the Soviet Union collapse is becoming more real, he's telling the Ukrainians, how did you get Crimea? Crimea is ours. But he couldn't do anything about it. He could do nothing about it. Has anybody read the just declassified telephone conversations between President Clinton and President Yeltsin? They're fantastic. They're amazing. They show you the incomprehension and arrogance on the American side, and the pathetic, unbelievably pathetic quality on the Russian side. Begging, don't do this, don't do that, but unable to get their way and enforce their will. So lo and behold, the Russians now, they still don't like the 1991 settlement, but they can do something about it, which is something they couldn't do in 1991. This is Versailles Treaty, 1919. This is a version of it. You can argue that the treaty was punitive, that Russia was cheated, that Russia should have got a better deal in 91, that we screwed the Russians over. However you want to make that argument. Or you can argue that, you know what, the treaty was fine. They lost the Cold War, they were a menace, and we earned our victory. We stood up to that menace. They collapsed from within based in part upon our pressure. And therefore, we need to enforce that 1991 settlement, just like the British should have enforced 1919. Well, we signed a treaty where we were going to protect Ukraine's sovereignty if they gave up their nuclear weapons. We're signatories to that treaty. And they gave up the nuclear weapons, and Russia took the Crimea, and what did we do?
Cool.
It kind of looks like we're the British here. It kind of looks like we're shrinking from the responsibility of enforcing that settlement. So you can either exhort us to send 250,000 troops, your people in this room or your children or grandchildren, to be stationed to evict the Russians from Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and to stay there so the Russians don't come back. Or we can recognize that we were bluffing, that we did that when Russia was not a great power anymore, and they are a power again. They're not a power on the level they were before, but they keep collapsing and collapsing and collapsing, and yet they're still there. So we need a relationship with them where we don't have to appease them, we don't have to give in to them, we don't have to surrender to them, but we can't pretend that we're going to do things we're not going to do, like send 250,000 troops to Ukraine to evict the Russians from Ukraine and to stay there permanently. If we're going to do that, fine. But I just don't see the appetite in the United States for that kind of sustained confrontation. Maybe there are other ways to deter Russia, short of that, but ultimately, and there are in my view, but ultimately, we need a relationship with Russia that recognizes that they exist, that they're still there. This doesn't mean rewarding good behavior, but it does mean, excuse me for this word, being realistic about our ability to overturn or what Russia did and or defend that settlement from 1991, which was an anomalous situation when Russia was flat on its back and is no longer in that situation. So my view is we need to deter Russia, but we need to deter them in those areas where we're really strong. It doesn't make sense to fight against Russia in those areas where they have an advantage. So in eastern Ukraine, the Russians have a greater advantage than we have. They're right next door. They're going to stay there for a really long time, on the other side of the border, I mean, even if we evict them. And Ukraine itself is a difficult proposition in terms of its stability to necessarily stake the Western order on. Now, people say that Ukraine was cheated, and I agree with that. However, is it Ukraine that we should take the stand against Russia, where they have strengths and we have weaknesses? Why can't we take the stand against Russia, where we have the strengths and they have the weaknesses, and begin to deter some of this behavior? But if you do the deterrence, if you show the strength, you need a negotiation process, you need bargaining, you need diplomacy. Otherwise, the strength of deterrence is wasted. You can't do sanctions for 300 years. You could do them for a certain amount of time, and they're necessary, and I applaud them. What's the next step? Where do we want to get in the relationship? How can we get to a place where they're not incentivized to do spoliation, but they're incentivized to do either less spoliation or even to cooperate? And so we need a deal which revises the 1991 settlement. And you're going to say to me, that's crazy, that's unfair, that's amoral, that's just, I mean, look what the Russians did. And I agree what they did. But the Crimea is going back to Ukraine the day after Texas goes back to Mexico. If you think that it's likely that Texas is going back to Mexico, then it's likely that Crimea is going back to Ukraine. If you don't think Texas is going back to Mexico, then you need an alternative strategy for defending Ukrainian sovereignty and for deterring Russian aggression. And that has to be where we're strong, which is obviously in that jugular that I was talking about, the finances, the anti-corruption. We have sanctions in place, they're just not very serious. They could be much more serious. We could ratchet up and put tremendous pressure. This would require, as many of you know, that we deal with some of these things like our own offshoring, like our own Fonseca law firm, like many of those vulnerabilities on our side that they're exploiting. And so we have to come to grips with the fact that the problem is here rather than there in order to deal with the problem that's over there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We will open the floor to questions. We will bring microphones around, so...
I wait for them to get the mic.
Well, no, you point out somebody and then somebody will bring a mic to them.
Yes, sir. I see here, and then I see a woman over there. Go ahead.
Well,
it's okay, I do a Madeleine Albright, and I stand on the elevated... usually she did it behind the podium.
Thank you for the great lecture. It was really good. A real quick one. How's the third book coming?
Thank you for asking. And do you work for Penguin Publishers? Yeah, the third book is a massacre. It is very difficult. It's World War II and the Cold War. And in fact, it doesn't end in 1953 because Stalin, after he's dead, is still the biggest personage in that country. So it's occupying, it's taken over my life, and it's still years away. And I hope the interest is still there. when the thing actually eventually comes out. But thank you, and it's a long way from New York, from Penguin offices to come down here to ask that question, but I appreciate it. Yes, we had a woman over there.
You mentioned ratcheting up sanctions to cut off the cash flow.
Yeah.
How would you get Europe on board with increasing sanctions, and is there a fear that overusing sanctions will make the tool ineffective?
So you got to make the case that what you're doing is necessary and justified. If you just announce things, if you just do things because you're America, and you don't have the kind of consultative process, and you don't bring forward the evidence in the public sphere where it can be verified, debated, right, then of course you can't bring anybody on side. Remember, there are a lot of financial interests and business interests at stake, but look what the Germans did. The Germans were willing to sacrifice significant business and financial interests to recalibrate that relationship with Russia. Right? And that was a big step for them, and they were willing to do it, and they had an internal discussion and a public debate and why it was necessary, and the business community didn't resist fully, and many of them joined voluntarily. So let's take something as simple as the Russian planes that buzz our airplanes or that buzz our ships. Right? I believe that we should shoot those planes down. Yeah, honestly, I believe that. How would you go about doing that? Well, you would videotape the incident. And then you would make that videotape of the incident available, of the buzzing, available to all the media globally. In fact, you would allow the media on board to videotape if they want. And then you would say, this behavior is inappropriate, and it shouldn't happen. And then, of course, they would do it again. And you would videotape it again. If you didn't have the evidence, you couldn't do anything. But if you videotaped it again, and it showed their aggressive action, and it was a second time, then you could issue a warning. And then you can say, if you do this again, there will be consequences. And then they think you're bluffing, and they buzz you again. And if you have the third buzz videotaped, just like the first two, then you can shoot it down because you videotaped the first two and you've issued the warning and the evidence is there and the Europeans are not going to say that the Americans are making this up. And then you shoot the plane down and what happens? Russia declares war on the United States because their $1.5 trillion economy is going to take on the American economy, right? Their small special forces that seized Crimea where they already had a military base and where the Ukrainians decided they wouldn't fight, they're going to overrun U.S. assets abroad. I don't think so. They're going to show that they're bluffing by buzzing our planes. But then, after you've shown the evidence and you've taken the deterrent action, then you need the Secretary of Defense Mattis to say, this is a terrible incident. We didn't want this to happen. We issued a warning. Now, how do we have a dialogue so that this doesn't happen again and we get to a better place? Because if it happens again, we're going to have to shoot them down again. But we don't want to do that. Right? This is how you do deterrence. I mean, where did we lose this skill? So that's the same thing you do in the financial system. First, you reveal the evidence. You begin to close down some of your own vulnerabilities. And then you begin to issue warnings. And you say, you know, if you keep doing what you're doing, we're going to have to remove you from the international banking system. We don't want to do that. It would be terrible if we had to do that. We don't want to collapse your economy. That would be not good for you, and maybe we would have to pay a price for that too. But if we're forced to do that, we'll do it, and we'll do it with our partners, and we'll do it with the evidence. And so this is how you're a superpower. Not by declaring unilateral acts, but by gradations, right, of deterrence, with evidence revealed to the public so it can be assimilated, verified, and debated. And then a negotiation process. Reagan didn't show strength because he wanted to beat his chest. He wanted to get a bargain where we bargained from strength. So we don't want to talk about your re-education archipelago in Uyghur. Really, we don't want to do that. But you know, if you keep stealing our technology, we're going to have to form a Uyghur government in exile.
Pakistan.
I'm so sorry we have to do that.
Just a weird name for it. They get to Taiwan
with more significant weapon systems.
And we
don't want to do that. We don't want to war. But if you're going to force us to do this, we're going to create governments in exile. We're going to go on a massive anti-corruption campaign because where's the Chinese money? We're going to cut you off from this and cut you off from that. We're going to evict your students from the universities. We don't want to do this. That's terrible. We're an open society. We want international exchange. So here's what you have to do for that not to happen, and here's the dialogue we're going to have so that we get to that better place. Right? This is Foreign Policy 101. Deterrence from strength, calibrated so as not to escalate beyond your control, combined with diplomacy, negotiation skills, and a sense of where you're going to get the relationship to go. You can't get everything in a negotiation. So with Putin, there are some things we're going to have to concede, and Crimea is one of those things. But you got to extract the price. What's the price? Well, you give them 25 years, process of recognition of Crimea. And it depends on their behavior elsewhere. And if at the end of the 25-year process, or whatever you can get, the 15-year process, if their behavior has been acceptable to you, then you can formally internationally recognize. But they have to pay compensation for it. They can't just have it for free. And moreover, they have to evacuate from eastern Ukraine, from Abkhazia and Ossetia, from that other trash can stand, Transnistria. They got to get out. And if they go back in, then during that long period of time, then we don't have the formal process of it's got to be gradation so that their behavior is incentivized in a certain direction. So we need a bargain over the 91 settlement, and we need to use those instruments which are at our command, but we need to have a sense that the relationship is going to go somewhere where we're going to make some concessions as well as extract major concessions from them. You know, we have to do diplomacy again. For example, we'll need a State Department again. Right? Yes. Okay, I think this gentleman over there and then this one in the front. Our leadership is going to pull the plug on this when we'll stick a fork in it when it's done. Thank you. Yeah.
So basically, Russian patriots, so-called patriots, Russians say that the West would like to see Russia collapse, but it will never do this because Russia is so strong and powerful and proud and so on and so on. The opponents of Putin say that actually the West can very easily bring Russia on its knee. There are tools like, for example, I can go on and on about what it can do. Yeah. But the question is, they say that the United States, the West, the United States specifically, would not like to see Russia collapse because it would be a too heavy price for the West itself. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so we could potentially try to collapse Russia, and then we could have China on the border with Hungary. You like that idea? I don't like that idea. You know, I'm not Bismarck. I don't have that kind of skill, right? But there's balance of power. There's a world out there, and Russia is part of our world. In addition, we could collapse Russia and we could get Russia back. This is the thing about, if you've ever seen the Westerns, those Hollywood movies where there were white hats and black hats, the white hats are the reformers. The black hats are the people we call the anti-reform, the reactionaries. And so we have white hats in Iran, we have white hats in Russia, we have white hats everywhere, where we're looking sometimes we don't see that the white hat and the black hat is actually a stripe down the middle and it goes around, and it's white and it's black and it's white. Anyway. So we got this idea that we could do better. We could get a Gorbachev type guy back. We could get a Yeltsin back maybe. We could get a reformer back. It's possible. Tell me right now what the historical popularity is of all those pro-Western Russian reformers are, historical figures, as opposed to the historical popularity of the anti-Western leaders of that country. The numbers don't look very good, do they? Yeltsin and Gorbachev, single digits. In Gorbachev's case, under 1%. Stalin, good numbers, really big numbers he puts up on the board still today. So the white hat, black hat thing, it's not a stable proposition necessarily. You got to take the world as it is. Collapsing Russia, okay, maybe we could try. And if we succeeded, we would get Russia again. And if we succeeded too much, we would get China expanded in Greater Eurasia potentially. Right, watch. Right now you see the China-Russia contest for Iran. We think everything's about us. China and Russia are going toe-to-toe over Iran. Why does Russia support Iran in Syria? Why does Russia support the Iranian militias elsewhere? Because if Russia turns on Iran, Iran becomes a satellite of China potentially. They lose Iran fully to China. And China just keeps eating Russia's lunch across Eurasia. So this is how we have to think about it. We have to live up to our values at home. We have to have restraints on executive power at home. We have to have an impartial professional judiciary. We got to have a parliament, whether we like the way it functions or not. If you do away with the Congress, it's a lot worse than if you see the Congress in its current state, right? So we got things where we got to live up to our values and support our institutions at home, and then we got to live with the world in a way that advances American values without the kind of overextension backfiring that we have. So Samuel Huntington, what did he say? Is Huntington okay in this building? Sam Huntington said, we've done it exactly wrong. We've done crazy diversity at home and universalism abroad. One worldism abroad, one American system imposed on everybody. And at home, we've hyphenated like crazy. And Huntington says, no, it's universalism at home. It's civic Americanism, civic citizenship, civic nation at home, and it's recognition of diversity abroad to deal with the world as it is. So that lesson, that Huntington, it's an eternal lesson. Right? That's kind of where we got to get to while also still living up to our values. It's not easy what I'm saying. Right? We're a democracy. Every foreign policy has to be rooted in the majority, in the people. You can't have a foreign policy that works at Cato, or that works at Heritage, or that works at Brookings. It's got to work in America. It's got to work in electoral politics. It's got to work in a democratic setting. So you can get up here and make a brilliant speech about restraint. I've made those speeches not brilliant about restraint. But how do you do restraint rooted in the American populace? The American populace gets overextension. They bought into that. The American populace gets abdication. That's where we are now. Between overextension and abdication, the smart policy is restraint. It's universalism at home, recognition of difference abroad. But how do you root that in a democratic majority? How do you tell stories about that so that's successful? How do you get that to work in an electoral democracy? We're very far from having that kind of foreign policy.
Hi. So I'm wondering, do you think that competitive authoritarian regimes can form values-based alliances, or are these regimes based too much in self-interest to have meaningful, lasting partnerships? And as a little subclause on that question, can you define illiberalism?
No, I'm around 10 though.
So illiberalism is anti-liberal in the 19th century constitutional order sense. Not democracy necessarily, but the old liberal, which has been confused with the modern liberal. So illiberal is anti-system. We have people today who are anti-system in the American public sphere. They are illiberal in their thoughts, in what they say should happen, in their critique of the judiciary, the press, the Congress, whatever it might be, right? However, we have liberal institutions that constrain them. The problem is when you don't have the institutions that constrain the illiberal behavior. Or you undermine, you undercut, you do away with the liberal institutions, right? The rhetoric is problematic, it matters. But it's the deinstitutionalization of a liberal order that's the real problem. And authoritarianism, right, is fundamentally illiberal. It's not anti-democratic always. We're now learning that there's a democratic dimension potentially to illiberalism. Just as we democratized liberalism over a long struggle, over a long period of time, expanded the category of citizenship. Can authoritarian regimes, illiberal regimes, have a kind of common value alliance across the world? Can democracies do that? We think democracies can do that. I'm not sure that our understanding of common values and alliances is fully in line with historical experience. It's possible to a limited extent on the democratic side. It's possible to an even more limited extent on the authoritarian side, right? There's no honor among thieves. One of the things about alliances is that they're based on common interests and they're based on trust. These regimes have no trust within themselves, right? They don't like each other, they fear each other domestically, they're full of mistrust. And then in dealing with so-called partners, they don't necessarily have a lot of trust. Stalin didn't trust Hitler. That's ridiculous, right? And they didn't have an alliance anyway, they had a non-aggression pact. But so there's a limited ability based on common values because they're defending against the liberal order. And so there's the commonality. But if they defeat the liberal order, they go after each other. And even before they've defeated the liberal order, they're going after each other. So the common interests are shallow. They're there, but they're shallow. So I don't think we have to worry about that. Let's put it this way. If we're America, we don't have much to worry about at all. Our institutions are phenomenal. Our economy is incredible. Our innovative culture, our university system, it doesn't look like, in reality, what it looks like on cable TV. It's got neuroscience, it's got AI, and it's got a couple of professors talking about Marxism or whatever, or postmodernism, right? And the students aren't taking those classes, are they? They're not in those classes. They're not in those majors, right? So we've got attributes and advantages that are breathtaking. There's never been a power like this, and it's difficult to ruin this thing. We've seen how difficult it is to ruin it, because there's a lot of people trying, like the Dickens, to bring us down. We're the only thing that can bring us down. Thankfully, that's not an easy proposition, and thankfully, we have institutions like Cato to remind us that we have to defend this instead of trying to bring it down. Thank you for your attention.
Zealous with the ammo burn. Don't kill me.
I use Linux over the past 8 years might be shocking to many people. A lot of people have trouble switching from Windows to Linux. As a person that's been in Windows for like 20 plus years, as a power user, I have more than 10 different professional certifications in Windows. Switching to Linux has been hard. But I will say, over the past 8 years of using Linux as my primary driver, there's been some really cool things that I learned, and this might help you switch to Linux, especially if you're an advanced Windows user. So the big thing here is you're going to run into some problems. A lot of people in Linux say, hey, Linux installs on everything. It does, but sometimes you're just not going to have a great experience. So let's break down some of the challenges I've had over the past 8 years, so maybe it helps you not beat your head against the wall. And if you actually want to see the full-blown, as it happened 8 years ago, I documented this entire experience. So I did Arch Linux for 10 days, I did Ubuntu for 30 days, I think there's a Fedora challenge in there, I did Manjaro, I distro hopped pretty much every week. People watching my channel are like, what distro is he on now? And they're like, wait a second, he wasn't on this yesterday. I'd be like, I know, I'm trying on everything. So I literally did it all, but the things that I learned during that experience was distributions really didn't matter. I needed to figure out what I liked and what I didn't like. And what ended up happening was when I was looking at distributions, many of those distributions like GNOME, KDE, XFCE, these were not distributions, but desktop environments. And many people, especially when you're new to Linux, choose your Linux distribution based on the look. And this is normal. They were like, oh, this is just new functionality. Well, it really doesn't matter. You can really switch out these on the fly without having to reinstall everything. And that's kind of a big deal. So that's one of the big things with it in like picking just a file manager. Like when I'm here and I launch my file manager, this right here is Thunar, and I really like Thunar. I figured out that's my file manager. This is actually from XFCE, but I don't really use XFCE. I just like their file manager. So you can actually mix and match different sections of these utilities based on your preference. And I think that's really cool. So that's the other thing. Pick out what you like about it. And then the other downfall I had honestly, first 60 days, I kept trying to use Windows programs that were Windows only, like Adobe products. Had so much in like Wine and other things I was trying to emulate inside of Linux because Linux folk were like, everything just works over here. God, skill issue, man. Just get good.
Oh my god!
But really, the biggest thing there is
why
everything is great. If you need Microsoft Office, if you are a professional and if you used Adobe for 10 plus years, you're going to be better served on Mac and Windows, and that's just a hard truth that you need to swallow. And that means either dual booting or possibly virtual machines, which I'll get into in a second because, spoiler, most people that watch me for my Windows utility, and a lot of times they're like, oh yeah, Titus is a Windows user. He doesn't use Linux. Oh yeah. This is what they see. But guess what? Joke's on them. We're actually in Linux. They just don't know it. So that's where I come from. That's my thing. And trying to use Windows programs on Linux, it's just not worth it. If it is one of those programs, I will use it, but I will dual boot and then use it. Or I'll use it in my virtual machine like I just showed. The other thing is gaming. Now, when I first got here in 2018, gaming was just really starting to take off. Steam was just doing like Proton and other stuff, and it was really cool. But the thing about gaming that you just don't understand is it may work, but a lot of times you might need extra modifications. And there's things that happen because almost every game is made for Windows that it's installed a little differently in Linux. So mod support doesn't necessarily work out of the gate, especially not how you know it in Windows. You kind of need a Linux counterpart. Now that's coming along, and it's really seeing massive strides with all the stuff Valve's doing, but it's still not quite as good as it is in Windows, and it's really important to know. But if you're using mostly older games, I would even say in 2026, it's a better experience in Linux. So it can be good, but not everything plays in Linux. And if you're really heavy with mods, like let's say you're a Skyrim freak that have just thrown money at Bethesda for the past, 12 years or something? 15 years? How long Skyrim been out? Oh my gosh, and so many mods. You know, you're doing all kinds of shenanigans with those mods. You're probably not going to have a great experience in Linux. So you should kind of know that. But for me, I want to show you my Steam replay real fast, just so you can see kind of the evolution of my Linux to Windows. And even though I have Windows and Linux both kind of installed here, I primarily use Linux these days. So here are the last 3 Steam replays from the past 3 years, just so you kind of just see the evolution in the past couple years. Now, a lot of Linux YouTubers might even hide this from you, but I'm going to show you my actual Steam profile. Don't judge me for the games I play. By the way, Age of Empires 4, masterpiece. You're wrong if you think it's not. I love my RTS. Anyways, I digress. So this is just kind of going through, but the big thing I wanted to show you here is what I'm using for playtime. 65% of playtime in 2023 was Windows, 32% was the Steam Deck, and 2% was on Linux at this time. My Linux install, I was kind of doing it, but a lot of that 2% was me just kind of showing off on stream or something like that, where I was like, oh, check me out, I'm a Linux gamer. But a lot of it was more Steam Deck and casual, and then the Windows side of things, I was doing heavy mods. At the time, Age of Empires 4 kind of had a desync issue in Linux, so I didn't want a chance doing a multiplayer match and getting desynced. So I was like, I'm not messing with that. And the other game I was playing at the time was Final Fantasy 11 online, and I was doing heavy modifications, especially with the Sheeta project and other things that were kind of injecting into the binary. And there's a whole different setup there. If you're ever familiar with 20-year-old plus MMOs, there's a lot of modifications to make it usable. So most of my 23 gameplay, I would say, was Windows. Now, the next year, 2024, well, let's look at what happened. Again, oh my god, this one I was playing a lot of Fallout 76. All right, you can judge me for that one. I accept. I deserve a couple hate comments for the Fallout 76. Totally get it. So playtime on this one, 78% Windows, 12% on the Steam Deck, and 9% Linux. Well, that's even worse. So what's going on here? Well, a lot of my playtime, I was kind of just going back and forth, and at this time, again, I was still kind of using Final Fantasy XI. It was already booted up inside, and when Recreation time came to be, even though I was mainlining Linux, a lot of my gaming still was being done on Windows. Until this past year in 2025, you're going to see a big difference and a big change here. One, I only played Final Fantasy XI. I finally quit it this year. Swear, I'm addicted to that stupid old MMO. Brain damage. Anyways, most of this year, you'll see it's kind of gone full circle here, and almost 80% of everything's Linux. 12% still Steam Deck. I still use my Steam Deck for like casual, and only about 10% Windows playtime. And I'm not sure, that was probably when I was developing WinUtil. I might have been dual booted inside, and I didn't want to reboot into Linux, so I just launched Steam from there. But there was nothing really I was playing that had to use Windows at this time, because I pretty much quit Final Fantasy XI. I was like, all right, there's all the other games now. They pretty much all play in Linux, and I'm not playing any like kernel anti-cheat games or anything like that. So almost everything this year so far has been Linux, and honestly, it's actually, I think this discounts December, which was even more Linux gameplay. And I even did some tests between Windows, Linux, and Steam Deck. You can kind of see the pie chart over here. It's just numbers gameplay, but really what the true tale of the tape is the actual playtime. So past that first year, and now that you've seen how good Linux gaming has gotten, you always check like ProtonDB to see where you might fit into this equation if you need it for anything, or if you're not heavily modifying games and you just want to play. Linux now is pretty much plug and play with a lot of Steam stuff, which is great. But the second year and beyond, I was trying to get the perfect install. And I think this is just like an inherent Linux thing. I always like to tinker a bit, but I pretty much stopped distro hopping at this point in time, and I just stick to the big three: Fedora, Arch, Debian, or a variant of that. I don't really do much past that. Desktop environments, I was doing some KDE and other things, but at this time, I moved to just window management, which is what I'm on right now. And I have a long history of IT development, and almost everything I like to do now, I just configure it in the terminal. So I don't need anything extra with my desktop environment. I just go ahead and program it in the terminal. And then for my window management, like everything you see here, if I launch multiple windows, you've seen this type of thing. You'll notice in my DWM, which I use for window management, the only thing here that's compiled and used in the system is this binary. So about 116K, not even a meg, and that's what runs my entire GUI. So I stripped all that out because often I would install too much stuff, or I would update my desktop environment, and then there'd be something that conflicted, and then all of a sudden my system wouldn't work all that well, or I'd have some bug. And I didn't like that. So now I kind of removed all that extra crap, and now I just literally update my system anytime. I gotta be here and just update it willy-nilly. And for the most part, I haven't run into any issues anytime I do a massive update. So live on stream, I'm just like, yeah, let's update. Just any other day, I can just update because I don't have to worry about something being incompatible with my 100 KD file, essentially. I don't have this massive desktop environment. I don't have all this other stuff. So I just do window management. Now, this isn't for everybody, but it's a big difference of why it's so stable for me. I think a lot of people try Linux, they install anything and everything, and then they do a big update like this, and then they have some dependency issue, and then something breaks. And then like, damn, I'm going back to Windows, I have no idea what happened. And there's just so much that goes into their system that they don't know where it broke. Where mine, if something breaks on this update, I only have one spot to go, and I'm like, okay, what happened here? Why isn't this launching? Oh, okay, let me fix that. And then off I go, if that ever happens. I mean, I think the last many updates I've done, I haven't really run into anything. Speaking of which, you'll notice, if you look right here, the uptime for this OS is 628 days. And Arch Linux isn't considered to be a stable version of Linux, but for me, it's incredibly stable. And I think that just speaks to having less as a full-blown environment, because with Windows and Mac, it's well done, but with Linux, I think less is more, where if you have less stuff to go wrong, you really don't have to worry about big updates or anything like that. Now, we do have some errors here. Let's let this update finish and we'll see what happens. So here we go. We have finished our updates. Everything's good. We probably do a reboot and do it, but I do this about once a week. Sometimes I forget. It goes, a couple weeks, even a month. Arch these days, actually, in one of my Insight systems, I hadn't updated Arch in many months, and normally that would break, 5 years ago. But in 2026, Arch team has done a phenomenal job, and I would say it's pretty darn stable. I haven't actually had any issues. I did use like CashEOS's kernel, which is optimized for desktop, and some of their binary packages, which is a little bit faster because they do something where it runs a little bit quicker. But you don't have to. Stable Arch is just fine. Past that, really, once I learned, hey, let's not, less is more. Let's just figure out what I want to use, and I just have my file manager, my window manager, and then I just configure everything through terminal. There's not much to break, and everything works fantastic. It's really fast. I don't have to worry about some big update or some big corporation saying you're going to install this crap on my system. It's wonderful, and I love the terminal. So understanding how Linux differs from Windows is actually quite nice. Like in Windows, when you go to install a program, it could get installed in program files 32-bit, program data. It could get an app package that gets thrown to a Microsoft Store. It could go into local data. It could go into roaming data. It could get installed a variety of different ways. Even old school programs get registry entries and get launched outside of your user folder. Windows is kind of crazy on how it installs things, and pretty much everything in Linux, if it's a user configuration, it's going to be in home user.config. If it's a system configuration, it's going to be in /etc. So they're kind of standardized. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, 90+% of all stuff falls in these two golden rules of Linux. And I love it. It's nice. I don't have to sit here and worry about what the hell's going on with packages. So very nice. And then for the things I do need, dual booting in virtual machines is great. Like I dual boot all the time. I would say Windows sometimes does update and it might break your bootloader, so I highly recommend if you dual boot, 2 hard drives is almost a must. Install Windows first, and then install Linux second, and have them install their own boot partitions on each one of their drives. If you don't know how to do that or you're worried about it, disconnect one drive when you go to install the other operating system if you really want to make sure, but it'll work great. And if like you only need a couple things from Windows every now and again, honestly, virtual machine it. Like this is a virtual machine right here, highly optimized, so most people don't even know it's a virtual machine. And it runs directly, I pass through a bunch of stuff, but you can make the virtual machines very performant on Linux, much more so than you can on Windows. And it integrates in very, very well, so I can even play games on that, and I don't even have to worry about it. Now, the other thing that I kind of talked about in the very beginning of this video was Linux hardware matters. NVIDIA versus AMD, which is better? Well, it just depends. Like if you're doing mostly productivity work, I would say NVIDIA can be better for like resolve people. NVIDIA is going to usually give better performance than your AMD counterpart. But if you're just a gamer and you want highly compatible system that doesn't require any extra modules, which you notice I didn't say drivers, it's because Linux uses modules that tack onto the Linux kernel. Believe it or not, Linux already has all the drivers for almost every system baked into its kernel, so when it boots up, there are no extra drivers to download. It either works or it doesn't. So hardware compatibility does matter, and AMD's is just baked in. Don't have to worry about it. NVIDIA does require some install, and you have to worry a little bit about those updates because that kernel module does break during an update. Your system won't boot, or it will boot, but it won't have a video output, which there's ways to fix, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Just know that is a thing. Sometimes that does happen, and it just depends on where you reside, on what your needs are, and what system you have. Both do work though. And then certain other things, variable refresh rate, 4K support, tearing. You probably heard of these things. Well, Linux like 5 years ago, almost everything used Xorg. Well, it doesn't have VRR, it doesn't have 4K support, and you have to modify, or well, you have to configure Xorg to not have tearing or be tear free by default. You can do all these things, and that's what I do. I still use Xorg, but most people these days use Wayland, and just know like almost every desktop environment, most people are huge in like Hyperland and other things you've heard about. Those are all Wayland. It's like the new blood coming into the space, and they do have support for that. So that's just something to know. And then also understanding leading edge hardware has worse support than both Mac and Windows. Almost everything built out on the market right now builds for Windows and Mac first, and then Linux is a second or an afterthought in a lot of ways. So if you buy a graphics card or a CPU on the day it's released, if you're using Arch, it'll probably work, but you might have poor performance because it might not be well optimized on that first day. But after 6 months or a year, usually you're good to go. So it just depends. So it's just important to know and to know these things and research them beforehand. When it comes to Linux, if you have good hardware support, you have everything built for it, and you understand the limitations of what you're doing, it can be the best experience ever, the most stable. That's why Linux people are like, my system, I haven't rebooted it in a year, and it's perfectly stable. Yeah, it is for them, but for you, it might be a different story. It just depends on where you're at in your journey. So I just want to share mine today. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.
Say is it's effort to switch. Do you know what I mean? There we go. That looks very familiar. Right, okay, so what we got here? The desktop environments. I thought they recommend that you don't do that. Next, just do GL. That'll do. Password. Okay, next. I don't know what any of it means, but so many of you rate this, so I had to try. Repositories. Steam. Oh, okay. This is nice. This is neat though. I guess what people like so much about this is what you don't get with Fedora is you get a baseline install. And then you build up on top of it, which is kind of what Arch is all about, right? You build your base install, and then you can just add whatever you want on top of it, so you don't get crap on there that you don't really need. Now, I don't know what I need for all of these. Valve's digital software delivery, so let's just install that and go, okay. Pursue. That's quite neat. It's a way of getting people to use the terminal without actually using the terminal. Processing, finished, okay. So we'll close that. What else would we need? Repo. Oh, there's so much in here. I guess you kind of need to know exactly what it is. Well, I'm just going to see what happens if I run Steam now. Do I need to install drivers for my graphics card? I'll put in repo and then Misa. What can we see the device select? No, that's all installed by the looks of it. No, it doesn't look any of the drivers though. Okay, let's see what happens. So if we go down to here and go Steam, my phone, is it running? Yep, just got to be patient with these things. Oh, hardware server, yeah, absolutely, because we're on Linux. Submit results, what we're running. Cashy OS, let's go. So I'm doing my bit. I'm doing my bit for Linux. Right, okay, so let's, what should we install? I want to do Arc Raiders. I don't know if I've got the audio sorted though, so I don't really want to play Arc Raiders. Actually, June would be a good one to install. Let's do that, because I kind of know how that plays. Oh, the thing is, this is a different setup than my main PC. So as you can see here, if I just make that full screen and just zoom out, you can see I'm running a Ryzen 7 3800X with a 6600 XT and 16 gig. So it's not as high a spec as my main PC. So I think what I'll do is I'll play it on here and then I'll record me playing it on Fedora on the same system. I'm not into doing benchmarking. That's not what I want to do with this channel, but I am interested to see what all the fuss is about. So we'll do that. So whilst that's happening, let's have a look at what else we get. So let's say we've got a new game. What's got new tips? That's going to be Proton, isn't it? Proton QT. I'll go back to, where's the welcome thing? How do I get to that then? What applications? Cashy hello, there we go. Software. All right, okay. So that's a list of all of the software. Installed apps. Oh, install apps, sorry. Oh, apps and tweaks. What's that all about? System update. Oh, I haven't done that yet, have I? Remove DB lock. Install gaming packages. Okay. Cashy extra version 3. Heroic. Okay, that makes sense. What's all this other stuff though? Mango HUD. I don't know what that is. Let's just do yes. That's pretty cool. Pac-Man, you know. Oh, there's errors there. Can't find some stuff. Now, I don't know if there's any audio. Press enter to exit. Okay, that's quite neat. Cashy OS package installer. Okay, so we're back to that again. Okay. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it is pretty cool. Where are we with the install? Nearly halfway. System update. There's nothing to do. Okay. So you don't even have to go into a terminal. Huh. Well, that is interesting. Already done. And then software. What's all? Oh, that's that, isn't it again? Apps and tweaks. Nope. Installed apps. Mail, internet graphics. That's going to have Critter and stuff like that, I suppose. GIMP, color paint. Oh, so it doesn't even install all the KDE stuff. Huh. My paint. Right, how are we doing with the install? Nearly there. Let's see if the audio is working. Think of the ad revenue. Hello, Linux gamers, and welcome to PUBG Black Budget. Well, so that's my main machine. And then if I go back into console, that's the one that we're on now. I know I just showed that a minute ago, but it's good to compare the two, right? Oh, that's messed up, isn't it? Let's just do that. Right, are we installed yet? It's going to be weird playing this after playing so much Arc Raider, where the movement is so good. I do remember this being a little bit clunky. All right, there we go. So what we're running at? 50 FPS. And the reason I'm looking at it looks good though. It does look good. CPU at 28, GPU at 99, which is good. 50 FPS. Oh, a little bit of a hitch there. The fact that it's night time is not helpful. Pretty sure I've got a torch I can use. There we go. I mean, it is quite a built-up area. The base I've made pretty grand, even though I haven't really filled up with anything yet. Okay. So it's certainly playable. Got some hitching there. Some tearing. I'm not, as you know, I'm not going to go in and change anything on the settings because I want to keep it exactly the same. But yeah, everything's great. I don't want to go off and do anything. I will end up dying. Got no storage space for water. I'm not supposed to be playing, am I? So there you go. That was CashioS. That was pretty straightforward. It worked great. It seemed very lightweight. It installed very quickly. The game runs fine. Fan's kicking off now. I can hear the fan going, although like 63C and 60 degrees on the GPU. And June is running surprisingly well on the older hardware. So there we go. I think, as I said earlier, changing from a distro that you've already established yourself with and you've built your understanding on is a bit of a challenge. Not because it's hard to do, but because there's no need for you to do it. Now, is there a need for me to switch over to CashioS? No, not really. I honestly think that if CashioS was the first distro that I found when switching from Windows to SteamOS and then to the next distro, then I'd still be on CashioS. The fact that I land on Fedora and I've spent 6 months on Fedora means I'm comfortable with Fedora. So I don't think it is a case of which one's best. I mean, this is great. I'm not going to lie. I am surprised. Out of all of the other ones that I've tried, this one has been great. But